DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app, online and on your smart speaker. Quality journalism, analysis and opinion that speaks for itself. John Pienaar at Drive on Times Radio.
Hello, I'm John Pienaar with Drive on Times Radio. Thanks for joining me. Does anyone still need to be convinced of the lethal threat from Vladimir Putin's Russia and the need to raise our guard higher, to do more, to spend more? Really, if you do, tell me why. And that's not a rhetorical question then. You know the text, 97222, start with the word Times, or a tweet to @Times Radio. Tell me what you think. And just look at today's report that Putin was personally responsible for ordering the famous poisoning of the Russian defector Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia at their home in Salisbury by Russian agents, and the fact that the killers mocked Britain afterwards. I'll have more on that report later on in the programme, and on MI5's failures to protect them. And coming up, the Foreign Office has announced Britain is prescribing Russia's GRU security agencies. Its office has murdered the Skripals. Or maybe that it hadn't happened already, but still, I'm going to be talking live to an expert on Russia's spying and global murder. Meanwhile, some good news on the effort by Ukraine's friends to help the country maintain its desperate resistance to the Russian invasion. The EU has moved closer to providing around 90 billion euros, enough to cover two-thirds of Ukraine's needs for 2 years. The UK is throwing some 8 billion euros using frozen Russian assets into the same pot. This is game-changing money, and I'm going to be finding out what difference it could make. I should probably add that when I mention Ukraine's friends and supporters, well, can I really include the United States and President Trump in that list? Donald Trump told the world that this week's US-Russia talks were reasonably good, though they had achieved nothing. He said Vladimir Putin would like to end the war, which may be true, so long as the war ends in defeat for Ukraine, which he refuses to recognise as a country. Still, Ukrainian envoys are talking to President Trump's envoys in the USA later, and we'll be watching for news from Miami. And by the way, speaking of the Trump administration, what do you make of the news that a startup company backed by Donald Trump's son, Don Trump Jr., has just been given a $620 million funding deal by President Trump's Department of War, as it has been renamed by President Trump, which is obviously good news for someone. I wonder what you think. Send me a text, 87222, start with the word Times, or a tweet to @Times Radio. First, though, let's talk about the European Commission introducing a proposal to use EU powers to seize frozen Russian assets to fund a reparations loan for Ukraine. It's worth 90 billion euros. Now, this was set out to prevent 210 billion in assets held in banks and clearing houses under sanctions measures. We can talk to Tom Keating from RUSI in Brussels for us for the conference taking place now on frozen assets. Hello to you, Tom.
Hi, good afternoon.
Good of you to join us, Tom. So this latest iteration of the plan, is this one going to go through?
Well, we're waiting for Godot, aren't we? I think we can safely say that the EU tries every possible plan until it finally finds one at the 11th hour. I think the EU is zooming in on a solution, and that solution is based on breaking the traditional unanimity that's needed in order to decide and agree ideas in the European Union. That's been the big blocker on all of this.
Yes.
Holdouts.
And when we talk about the blockages in member state terms, we're talking about Belgium, aren't we, which had legal worries about this, and of course in the background you've got others like Hungary, like Slovakia, Bulgaria, which in many ways are more sympathetic to Russia with reservations about an idea like this.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. So I think it's important to differentiate those who traditionally gripe about any action taken against Russia, so chiefly Hungary, but yes, those lining up behind Hungary, and then Belgium, in particular because the majority of Russia's frozen assets are held at a bank called Euroclear in Brussels, and Belgium has worried about the legal ramifications of taking measures to allow those assets to be used to support Ukraine.
Okay, just a word on those legal worries on the part of Belgium. How could such a move as this be challenged? And where could Russia hope to bring a lawsuit and win it? And we're talking, I know, about the possibility of local courts in local jurisdictions, the European Court of Human Rights, although Russia has no time for that. And there are protections available in some cases to the United Nations. But what does it mean? Why is there this deep concern?
Well, I think first and foremost, the concern is misplaced. But I think, as we all know, the cost of lawsuits is, of course, in the ultimate judgment, but it's actually in the time and money that is spent working through those over, in this kind of case, many, many, many years. So I think Belgium has some concerns about the cost. Now, I think most international law scholars will tell you that what is being proposed meets international law standards, and critically, it can be reversed. So let's say Russia comes to its senses, goes back to its own border, pays reparations, and does everything that is required under international law, then this loan could be repaid and the assets could be returned to Russia. So this is an important thing to bear in mind. We're not talking about seizing and confiscating Russia's assets. We're talking about using them as collateral for a loan. That's a very different thing.
Yes. And just a word on the action by the British government today, the proscription of the GRU, which is the agency successor to the KGB. What difference will that make? What practical effect would it have?
I don't think it makes any particular. I mean, I should say I'm a son of Salisbury, so I follow the Skripal case very closely. I don't think it really makes any difference. It just kind of adds to the story, which is that Russia is a malign actor. Russia is seeking not only to prosecute a war in Ukraine, but it's also seeking to create problems in the UK. It's seeking to disrupt elections in nascent democracies like Moldova. It's a country that cannot be trusted. And we need to continue to remind people that just because Russia isn't necessarily in the headlines doesn't mean that it's trying to undermine our democracy.
So it's largely symbolic, as one might imagine. I mean, good to talk to you. Thank you so much. Tom Keating in Brussels. Now, let's get the thoughts of Ollie Wright, the policy editor of The Times. Hi to you, Ollie.
Hello.
On this move, the latest move to use the assets, the billions of assets frozen in the jurisdictions of the EU to back up a loan, to underpin a loan. The British government, obviously not part of the European Union, but has been supporting this action for some time.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. We've been one of the more significant proponents of it. Why? Well, there are two reasons, really. The first is that Ukraine faces a very significant funding gap next year and the year after that. Put bluntly, they don't have the money to carry on the war, and this is one way that the European Union thinks that can bridge that gap. So that's one of the primary reasons. And secondly, and it's interrelated to that, by releasing this funding, they hope to put pressure on Moscow as a sign of intent to say, look, you can't just hope to drag this thing out. We're going to keep funding it. Ukraine is going to have the money to prosecute this war. So you better come to the negotiating table.
Right. And meanwhile, the Russian ambassador is being called in to the Foreign Office, presumably one of those meetings without coffee. It's a sort of a ritual, isn't it, calling in the ambassador when you're upset with the country and giving him a dressing down. But again, it's pretty ritualistic.
Yeah, I think that's right. It is, as you say, what you do. But I think Putin knows what the UK government thinks of Russia and thinks of him. So I'm not sure he's going to be hugely enlightened by whatever his ambassador tells him.
Yeah, and when it comes to the GRU, there's a curious relationship, isn't there, Ollie, between different countries and their embassies, where it's understood that intelligence operatives operate out of embassies. But from time to time, when there's a confrontation, someone is expelled.
Yeah. I mean, everyone, it's a sort of, just a silly way of putting it really, but it's an open secret. We have MI6 agents working in our embassy in Moscow, and in the Russian embassy here, you've got agents of the Russian state. And, in some senses, the public doesn't know who they are, but the government has a pretty good idea who they are, and more to the point, our intelligence services have a good idea who they are. And, where you see that come out in public is when you do have some sort of diplomatic spat and you want to make a point, so you expel someone and they expel a few more, and then eventually over a period of time they're replaced.
Right. Now, okay, we're going to be discussing that in just a moment. In the case of the Skripal killings, which, as I say, we're going to be looking at in more detail, the killers, the GRU officers who came in and murdered the Skripals, they smuggled themselves in from outside, they left, and then they pretty much mocked Britain for what they were able to achieve. On the wider front, where the confrontation with Putin is concerned and the war in Ukraine, I'm listening to Yvette Cooper over the last couple of days. The language maybe seems to be getting a little bit tougher, and the bit which is not quite said, I guess for diplomatic reasons, is all sides, certainly in Europe, others of Ukraine's friends, really want Donald Trump to start getting tougher than he has been.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think they don't want to say it, and indeed they don't feel they can say it because of what the reaction in the White House might be, but they feel very strongly that there is not a deal on the table at the moment which is acceptable to Ukraine, which is acceptable to Europe, that the Russians will be prepared to sign up to. And what they're in this sort of elaborate game, as it were. They don't want to criticise the Trump regime, but neither do they want to give any ground that they think could be sort of disadvantageous to Ukraine, particularly in terms of territory. So there's a lot that's on the public thing. They want to thank Trump for his efforts, but at the same time in private say, look, really this isn't good enough, and this isn't good enough for this reason and that reason. And they are very worried about the prospect of America trying to do a deal with Russia behind their backs.
Right, Ollie Wright, the policy editor at The Times. Thank you, Ollie, as always. So the public inquiry into the death of Dawn Sturgis, who died from Novichok poisoning in Salisbury, as a victim, the collateral damage from the murder of the Skripals, it concluded the assassination orders would have come from Vladimir Putin. The chair of that inquiry, Lord Hughes, found that the attempted killing of Sergei Skripal amounted to a public demonstration of Russian power. So we're going to be looking further at that report a little bit later on Drive. Now, though, I want to welcome Andrei Soldatov, the expert on Russian security services. Hello to you, Andrei.
Yeah, hello.
Hi, well, good to have you here. Can you just tell us all just a bit more about the GRU and its role as, well, effectively as an assassination bureau, among other things?
Well, GRU, Russian Military Intelligence Agency, is the main Russian intelligence agency, and in the late 2010s, it went through a period of very dramatic reforms. Previously, it was a very Soviet organization, which was never under any kind of reform since the 1990s. But under first President Dmitry Medvedev, then Putin, it significantly expanded. And the problem was that around the time of the annexation of Crimea in 2014, 2015, this agency got on board lots of new talent, as well we can call them, many of them with special forces background. And these people brought with them a very special kind of mentality of people who just want to get things done, no matter if they are getting exposed or even caught.
Indeed. And the role of Putin himself, I mean, it is, isn't it, generally assumed that when it comes to a high-profile assassination, those orders will come from the leader of Russia, Vladimir Putin.
Yes, unfortunately, it sounds very credible. The problem is that over 25 years, the system of control of the Russian intelligence and security services changed dramatically. At the beginning, say in the 2000s, it was possible to argue that at least some elements of the Russian intelligence services were not completely under control of Putin. There were some fields and wars between them. And that was the argument used by some people, arguing that, for instance, the poisoning of Alexander Litvinenko in 2006 was not sanctioned by Putin personally. But by 2015, it became really clear that Vladimir Putin decided to make sure that everything in his agencies were completely under his control. He sent several people in his agencies to jail to make this point. So there is no doubt that such sensitive operations as poisoning and assassinations would be directed and under control of Vladimir Putin.
Right. I mean, the report into the murder of the Skripals today, it makes the point that this killing was not simply a matter of revenge or retribution. It was also a demonstration of power. And I have myself seen clips of Vladimir Putin advertising his power to exact revenge and punish traitors. It's a point of pride for him.
Yes, it's also...
Andrei, are you still with us?
Yes. And it's not only that, it's also a message. I remember that several years ago when I was still living in Moscow, I was researching my book about the relationship between Russian political emigres and Kremlin security services. And the word Novichok, the substance which was used to poison Skripal, popped up in every conversation I had with Russian oligarchs, with Russian priests, with Russian political activists or politicians. It seems that even if Skripal survived, but people who were thinking that they live on an age and at some point they could be a target for Kremlin's attacks, they got this message that from now on the rules changed.
All right, Andrei, good to talk to you, and thank you. Andrei Soldatov, the expert on Russian security services. Now, coming up, we've got Lithuania's finance minister who'll be talking about Europe's plans to freeze those Russian assets and use them to give a very significant sum of money to Ukraine. And also why the health secretary has ordered a review into the overdiagnosis of mental health conditions. It's now 4:19. I'm John Pienaar on Times Radio Drive.
John Pienaar at Drive on Times Radio.
The Health Secretary, Wes Streeting, has confirmed that he's launching a review into rising mental health diagnoses, including ADHD, in Britain. It is prompted by concern that mental health conditions are fueling an increase in benefit claims. We can talk to Henry Shelford, who's Chief Executive of ADHD UK. Hello to you, Henry.
Hi, thank you for having me.
You're welcome, very welcome. Do you accept, Henry, there is an issue, a problem of overdiagnosis of ADHD?
Absolutely not. We've just had, and this is an independent review on the back of another independent review. We've just had the ADHD task force, which took, I think, around a year. And if I quote it now, we showed that in England there is consistent evidence that ADHD is under-recognised, underdiagnosed and undertreated, including with medication. We've had a study of over 9 million GP records that showed that ADHD was on a patient's record in 0.32% of the time, which is just roughly 10% of the actual population of people with ADHD. So what that is happening is there's more people being recognised as having ADHD, but that's an expression of how much we failed people for decades and are just finally catching up. And so, yeah, there is an increase in numbers, but it's still huge underdiagnosis.
Well, tell me then, Henry, how do you explain, if you can, I don't suggest you necessarily have all the answers, but how would you explain, do you think, the wide disparities ministers talk about in the rates of diagnosis between different NHS trusts and different areas?
Oh, that's really simple. So Sheffield, for the last place we have last year we have data from, it's BBC, they had over 6,000 people waiting, and in the last year of that data, they saw 3 people. So, of course, Sheffield's going to have an incredibly low diagnosis rate because it's an expression of abject failure. If you talked about a physical condition and said there's very low rates and it's because you've got no for medical facilities, it would be an outrage, and it should be for ADHD, and it is for ADHD, frankly.
Right, well, so your answer is that there are great disparities because some authorities just don't diagnose enough cases of ADHD.
Yeah, I mean, Sheffield, the wait time is around 2,000 years. The shortest wait time in the UK is around 16 weeks.
Oh, so tell me
that's the actual disparity.
All right, Henry, then I wonder what you say then to those, and there are many of them, who say that mental health conditions seem to be too easily diagnosed. Not in every case, but we are, in many cases, it is argued with some conviction, dealing with people who are maybe just dealing with the everyday stresses of life. You're familiar with that argument. And some people who are diagnosed with these conditions might just need support other than medical help under the NHS. Such things as going to work as opposed to staying off work, or more support from friends, or a more positive attitude to life, which sounds trite, but you understand the argument.
So first of all, ADHD is not a mental health condition. Like, much as I hate it, it's a disorder. And I have ADHD, so I technically have a disordered mind. For me to get a diagnosis, I have to be seen by a specialist. It's not something a standard GP can do. It's only diagnosed if it's provable it's had a debilitating impact on your life, and there's been evidence throughout your life. So it's a very high bar to getting a diagnosis. There's lots of conditions where we've developed our understanding. So, for example, PTSD in the Second World War, you would be considered a coward or you're weak. Yes. We now know it's a traumatic condition. Menopause was just women being, I think, awful attitudes I feel like I don't really want to repeat. We now know that to be a hormonal issue that we can treat. Dementia was just old people getting befuddled. We now know it's a disease that we're investing a lot to try and change outcomes for. And ADHD is in that grouping of conditions that we've learnt about more recently, and we're now looking to help and change people's lives with that information.
Right. So, look, and it is surely a relevant point to say that our understanding of mental health conditions has advanced, and treatment of those conditions has hopefully progressed with that growth of understanding of conditions. I wonder, when you take in such factors as the large number and the large increase of people who are staying off work and being given, as it were, the approval by their GP or a doctor to stay off work when they complain of anxiety, of being unable to function for that. Now, I'm not saying I'm an advocate of the argument that says that's done too often, but I put it to you that is the argument, and I wonder what you say to it.
Apologies for that. I honestly can't talk to that. Like I can talk to ADHD where, and certainly we see actually people suffering from anxiety and depression. But I can tell you, like, the people we see are trying so hard to succeed in their career, in their job, with their relationship. They're going for an assessment not because they're worried, because they're in trouble, and then the average wait time's 8 years. And so what the independent ADHD task force said was that this failure of support is causing a cost to the economy of 17 billion for the lack of support of ADHD people.
Yes.
So that number needs work, but obviously it shows the seriousness of the issue and the scale of the issue. But I think fundamentally one of the things that really makes me angry, like, so for ADHD, so if I want to get a job elsewhere, so I have ADHD, I take ADHD medication.
Yes.
If I want to get a job elsewhere, my medication stops. I have to go and get reassessed. I'm at the back of that 8-year queue. Not only is it a massive waste of NHS resources, essentially I can't go and get that job. So my economic abilities, and let's say I want to go to university somewhere, like, my economic opportunities, my education opportunities are limited because of this NHS failure.
Yes.
And then it sort of feels like we're getting blamed for that as well.
Yeah. Look, when we look at it with a focus on the condition of ADHD and the treatment of ADHD, again, I hear completely what you say. It is a real mental health phenomenon, and it needs to be treated where it's correctly identified. The perception then that maybe too many people are diagnosed with that condition as a kind of catch-all for just being in a bad place mentally, and perhaps better treatment for those people should and would be available. Do you recognise that argument, and do you want to address it?
Absolutely not. Like, so the amount of steps and hurdles to go and get an ADHD diagnosis are huge, and yeah, and the fact that you have to go and be seen by a specialist in the condition, it makes it very hard to. And we've done studies on this. Like, we don't see people getting a diagnosis that they shouldn't. So yeah, no, I honestly I don't see that argument at all. And the idea that it's a catch-all, ADHD is a well-described mental disorder. Dude, like a deficit disorder is a terrible, horrible name.
Yes.
Yeah, the reality is it's in no way a catch-all. It is, but what it is something that is only recently becoming part of the public attention. And that is changing. People are going, well, this is the first time I've heard about it. And that's really more about society and them than it is about us.
Yes, yes. And so when you hear that the Health Secretary is launching a review into rising mental health diagnosis, apparently including ADHD, what do you say to that and to him?
So, like, when you look at the targets of the announced report are kind of laudable. So it says to raise the healthiest generation, increase healthy life expectancy, and to reduce suicide. And look, people with ADHD are more at risk of suicide and have lower life expectancy. 1 in 4 women and girls with ADHD will at some point try and take their own life. A woman with ADHD will die on average 9 years younger than her peers. A man with ADHD 7 years younger than his peers. And so the idea that the issues and challenges that ADHD are finally being recognised is, you know, I'm potentially naive. This review could progress the recognition of ADHD. But the reality is we've already had an independent task force. We had the ADHD task force. It reported very clearly that there's underdiagnosis and a lack of support. And so really what I'm worried about is that the government's failure to bring a political solution to the rising cost of welfare means they're instead looking to run roughshod over decades of medical progress and recognition, in particular for ADHD.
Henry Shalford from ADHD UK, thank you for coming on.
Thank you.
Now, coming up, I have the latest for you from the world of business with Robert Miller from the business desk of The Times. And we're going to be talking more about the EU proposal to use frozen Russian assets to fund a big loan to Ukraine. And we're going to be talking about the curious case of a group of nuns who are accused of helping the Kremlin. It is 4:31. Let's get the news with Tom Noonan.
across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. John Pienaar at Drive on Times Radio.
Now, if you are a digital subscriber to the Times and the Sunday Times, you can select from a range of newsletters going straight to your inbox. News, business, fashion, beauty. You can stay well informed on the topics that you love. Now, subscribers can sign up by going to the My Newsletters section of the Times website or to the Live app. Time now is 4:34.
Times Radio Business News.
And welcome Robert Miller from the business desk of the Times. How does you, Robert?
Hello there, John.
What's new in the markets?
Well, both the FTSE 100 and the FTSE 250 have ended higher at 32 points for the FTSE 100 and 67 or 68 for the 250. I think what's remarkable is I counted 30 companies, big companies, are now trading at the moment without the right to the next payout. So they, generally speaking, go down, and yet they still end up, and these are big names, the property companies, Bellway, they were down more than 1%, British Land 2%, Pets at Home also 2%, just because they're not paying, the shares aren't paying a dividend at the moment. Looking at sort of no particular running order, SSP, we know it probably better as upper crust and the Cafe Ritazza and the airports and railway stations. They've called in consultants to look at underperforming continental European rail business. I mean, that cheered the market. It's got a New York fund manager activist sitting on the board agitating for change. And I think what really boosted the shares, and they were topping the FTSE 250 by quite some way, is that they said they're looking at the joint venture that they have in India. Big business, floated on the stock exchange, but if they divested of that, then there'd be a lot of money to come back to shareholders. So they like that idea. Diageo, obviously Guinness and Smirnoff maker, downgrade from UBS, so the shares went down. AJ Bell, the investment platform that a lot of people will know, I think there's been a bit of profit taking there, but the results came in as expected, although they do expect, and they did take a bit of a dropping, but I think that was profit taking. Fraser's Group, always very interesting, the Sports Direct owner, pre-tax half-year profit was okay, but that was largely as a result of its stake in Hugo Boss. We've got Watches of Switzerland. I think they are probably responsible for some of Burberry's little bit of a bounce today. Their half-year sales were up, and what I think was most interesting there, they said the US tariffs don't appear. They've obviously had an effect on the business, but the shares down, I think, largely because of profit-taking there. And Trustpilot, well, that's in a category of its own, down 32%. There's a research company. We don't know a lot about them. We call them Secretive Grizzly Research, and they've actually made allegations about their model and saying that to some extent it's extorting money from people who pay to be on it. They've naturally enough denied it, but 32%, that's a heck of a thing for something that isn't proven yet. Looking at oil, we got up, it was down this morning, now up a little bit, but it's still around about $63, which is fairly low at the moment. And the pound, well, it's definitely in favour, certainly compared with the euro and the dollar. It's up at 134 against 133 yesterday. So let's rejoice on that one.
Okay, Robert, and some new data, new analysis of maybe an unhelpful aspect of the budget.
Very unhelpful, John. This is Calliston. This is the collective funds. Most people have them in their ISAs, and also their, to a certain extent, their self-invested pension funds. Yes, $3 billion was withdrawn in November. That's the second worst month on record, and the previous one was October, when we know budget speculation was rife. The head of Calliston has come out and said we saw this accelerate in October, $3.6 billion, and that has now extended for 6 months. It's the longest outflow of funds, and that really affects everybody, and it shows there is a lack of confidence, and you wonder where, because actually the FTSE 100 is up 18% year to date, so you're probably missing out on some gains, and it definitely has caused a big ruction, I would say, and it's only just beginning to come back.
Robert Miller, thank you.
Times Radio Business News.
So let's have a closer look at that European Union plan to use frozen Russian assets to provide a huge loan to Ukraine. Christopoulos Vaitiakounas is the Finance Minister of Lithuania. I'm happy to say he's joined us live on the line. How to you, Minister?
Hello, good evening.
Thank you for joining us. Tell us then, can Ukraine expect to get these funds? And if so, when will that happen?
Well, the Ukraine needs funds. It needs funds in the first quarter of 2026, and the European Union will ensure funding. And in our opinion, the best option is definitely the reparation loan. Other option as a common borrowing is far less attractive, as it would put a much larger burden of financial systems of member states. So we urge for the use of frozen assets and for reparation loans. And that would be a priority.
So a huge amount of these frozen, seized Russian assets are held in Belgium, aren't they, using the institution Euroclear? And they're worried about being sued and paying a penalty for the seizure of the assets. Is that a legitimate fear, do you think?
I think the fear is of course legitimate, but I think that European Commission now proposed some safeguards for Belgium, and I think they should be sufficient to persuade Belgium to use these safeguards as an argument and to agree on this use of frozen assets.
Okay, now getting to the point of agreement has been difficult, hasn't it? Some members of the European Union are not sympathetic to this sort of action in support of Ukraine. Some of them are more supportive of Russia, a lot more supportive than other members. I mean, how have you dealt with that? Have there had to be trade-offs to bring some of those countries, well, like Hungary in particular, I suppose, into line?
Yes, of course. There are 27 countries in EU, and some of them have a very different view to the geopolitics, to foreign policy, to who our friends and enemies are. And of course, the country you mentioned is it's particularly difficult to deal with because you have to somehow make this compromise, make this agreement to persuade them to use some mechanisms to push them. It's very difficult, but for now, Europe is moving forward. We achieve what we needs to be achieved. Of course, we could move faster. This process could be smoother, but at least it's moving.
Now, tell me, in your view, Ukraine wants to join the European Union at some point in the future. Is that a realistic aspiration?
Yes, it's definitely realistic. And Ukraine had to be the member of Europe long ago.
So you think it's realistic? And yet there is some debate about that. I mean, will there be, across the European Union, the same view that you express there? Will we see some of the more Russian sympathetic countries taking the same view?
After negotiations and persuasions, I think everybody will agree on that. Listen, the war is in Europe. It's now fought on the land of Ukraine, but the war is against us, and Ukraine defends us all, and everybody understands that. Even some countries who object now these proposals for support, everybody understands that. And the grand prize for Ukraine should be the membership of in European Union.
Yeah, well, that is a view that would be music to Ukraine's ears, certainly. While you're with us, Minister, I must ask you, as things stand, the United Kingdom and British defence industries are prevented from bidding for contracts to sell British munitions, British military supplies into Europe under the European Union's Defence Fund. Do you support that bar?
Actually, I'm not very familiar with the problem, but of course we should work together. United Kingdom is the part of Europe. Maybe it's not a part of European Union, but it's part of Europe. It's part of Western Alliance, and we should work together. We should use all the resources we can accumulate, because there is a shortage of military resources, of military munition, military equipment. We should use all the resources and not to look at our some objections we have against.
No, as you know, some countries, including France, take a different view. But for now, Kristupas Vaidekūnas, the Finance Minister of Lithuania, thank you.
Thank you very much.
Now, shall we talk a little bit about cricket? Might cheer us up on this Thursday afternoon. Then again, it might not. The Ashes, it looked pretty grim earlier today, didn't it? Elizabeth Ammon is the cricket reporter for The Times. Hi to you, Elizabeth.
Good afternoon.
Welcome, as always. It is invariably true, Elizabeth, that as soon as I turn on the Ashes, we lose a wicket or we get knocked for 6 at that precise moment. And it happened again this morning, predictably. I turned on and there was Stokes running off impossibly down the wicket and duly run out. But it wasn't all that bad, was it?
No, it began, for those hardy souls who got up at 4 o'clock, it began really badly, and we were England were 5 for 2 within 7 balls. But then things rallied, and Joe Root scored, got the monkey off his back, and got the a century in Australia, which he hasn't done before. It was a magnificent one because he came in the second over with England in all sorts of trouble, and this is his 40th Test century. He is one of the greats of the game, and it was a really difficult one. He had to really battle, but he managed to get England into a fantastic position at the end of the first day. There were some wobbly points. They lost quite a lot of wickets just as the evening session, the last session, it's a day-night game, started with that Stokes run out where Stokes set off for a mad single, as you say. It was never there, and was sent back by Root and was run out by a direct hit. Then there was a clatter of wickets, but then there was a magnificent partnership, 10th wicket partnership at the end between Joe Root and Jofra Archer, where they were tonking the ball all over the Gabba and put on 61. So England were in a really good position at the end of day one. They'll be really pleased with it. Right,
so what actually went on here? We had 4 batsmen out for England for a duck. Then there was a decent 76, and then you've got the big century from Root, and he's still there, isn't he? So what is going on? It can't be the wicket. What is it?
Well, some of it was bad shots. Harry Brook played a particularly bad shot. Mitchell Starc is the king of the pink ball, and this day-night match is being played with a pink ball. And he played a booming drive outside the off-stump, a really reckless shot, just as Mitchell Starc had come on for a new spell. So that was really reckless. Ollie Pope played a bad shot as well. The rest of the wickets were probably through some pretty good bowling. Mitchell Starc ended up with 6 wickets for the day. I mean, he's tearing through in this series. He's got I think he's got 18 wickets now in 3 days worth of cricket. So it was a combination of some reckless playing, but also some very sensible playing. Pleasingly, Zach Crawley, who got 2 ducks in the first match, looked solid. He played in the way he plays. He plays, aggressively and high risk. But obviously Joe Root anchored the whole thing and showed really just how you do it. You kind of absorb the pressure, unleash when you can, and he really kind of set the way for the other England batsmen to have a look at.
All right, Elizabeth, thank you. Elizabeth Ammon, fingers crossed for overnight. Now, after 5, more on the US Secretary of War, Pete Hegseth's conduct over the second missile strike on a Venezuelan vessel in the Caribbean. We're going to be talking about government funding on its way to Donald Trump Jr. We're talking about hundreds of millions of dollars on its way to the president's son from the president's Pentagon, and a former ambassador to Moscow, and what it needs to change after today's inquiry into the Salisbury poisoning. It's now 4:47. I'm John Pienaar on Times Radio.
John Pienaar at Drive on Times Radio.
Well, there is then going to be a big review into the diagnosis of ADHD, autism, anxiety and depression. The issues of mental health and neurodivergence are especially prevalent among young people. A sixth of children between 5 and 16 are likely to have a mental health problem. That's according to the Children's Society. We can talk to Rhiannon Evans, the head of public affairs at Mumsnet. Hi to you, Rhiannon.
Hi there.
Welcome to you, Rhiannon. The issue of mental health among the very young, it's really startling how much worse it has got, especially since the pandemic.
Yeah, absolutely. And you can actually see it really clearly in the data and from conversations on Mumsnet. So we look at the past decade, there's a steady rise, and we hit the pandemic, and obviously there's an explosion of conversations around children and young people's mental health and from concerned parents. And then that's never really leveled off. We've seen a kind of a new and higher baseline. So it's clearly something that's increased in salience and importance for parents. And obviously that reflects the NHS statistics around diagnoses as well.
And you talk all the time about what this really means in homes and in classrooms. Can you just illustrate it for us, for those who don't experience this? What are we seeing in classrooms? What are we seeing by way of, behavioural evidence from young people in daily life and in relationships? What are you hearing about?
Yeah, well, there's a whole host of ways in which this manifests itself. I see something we hear a lot about on Mumsnet is around school refusal, and obviously that's a really kind of something that can be linked back to the pandemic often, I think, because obviously there were a couple of years where kids were in and out of school, and that has created its own set of problems. I think often some of the issues can be kind of mischaracterized as bad behavior, so issues around kind of anxiety, not wanting to go to school or feeling overwhelmed in the classroom.
Yes.
Can kind of be characterized as naughtiness as opposed to, actually a child that's struggling with their mental health. And then I think the other thing that's really clear from the conversations on Mumsnet is the impact it has on parents as well.
Yes.
We know it can be difficult to get the support that you need for your kids. Waiting lists for CAMS are incredibly long. Often there's a bit of a postcode lottery. And parents tell us sometimes when they're seeking that help, it feels like they've almost taken out a second job, the amount of paperwork they have to do, the amount of advocating they have to do for their child. So it has a real impact in the family as well, not just for the specific child concerned.
Yeah, we're talking about a lot of pain for an awful lot of families. It must be really awful in so many cases. I heard it also argued this morning that the rise of tech and smartphones has also not been a helpful influence. And the way people do their parenting now, in many cases, the idea is that so many parents are delegating their parents, if you like, to smartphones, and nobody's gaining from that. Is that a fair point?
So I think I wouldn't agree with the characterization of delegating parenting to smartphones. I would say certainly that a lot of parents are struggling with the impact of social media and smartphones and how to control that for their kids. And they're stuck, in a really difficult position because smartphones are such an integral part of everyday life now. It's not just about being on social media and staying in touch with your friends, although that's part of it. Also things like bus passes, homework apps,
Sure.
Kids need to have smartphones for their daily lives, but then parents are also confronted by the evidence that shows, we know there's a link between anxiety and depression and excessive use of social media. And we know that parents are worried about the effect of that on their kids' brains, and particularly the effect of those kind of addictive algorithms.
Yes.
But then if they try and combat that, they're basically fighting the might of big tech as individual parents. So
Yes.
that makes it really difficult.
Yeah, without though wishing to sound censorious about this, there are also so many cases out there of families where parents are scrolling through their phone just as their kids, however little, are also scrolling through their phones. And the ways of parenting, the ideal ways of parenting, which was known and imagined, and people in so many cases are brought up to try to emulate, that just falls by the wayside again and again in so many households.
I mean, I certainly think the point about parents experiencing the same issues around phone use, we know as adults the effect a phone has on your brain, and obviously that's having an impact on kids as well. I think there is definitely life feels a lot harder for parents. I think, maybe the traditional setup of one parent staying at home may have been something that was slightly different and easier to manage in terms of child rearing. Now, if you've got two parents going out to work, which for most households is the only way to kind of counter the cost of living, life is stressful. You're struggling for time, and it can make life quite difficult. So I think some parents would agree that parenting nowadays is harder. I think smartphones and social media are part of that. But again,
Yes.
I wouldn't agree with that kind of characterization of delegating parenting to smartphones, or indeed kind of parents spending time on their phones that they should be spending with their kids.
Yeah, no, I hear what you say to that argument. I'm looking at a statistic that says that a third of those, 34% of those between 17 and 23, are referred into NHS services. They're not accepted into treatment. That's quite a big disparity. I wonder if there's anything to be read into that.
I think it's an interesting question, and I don't think anybody would dispute the importance of making sure that diagnoses are accurate and that the people who need it are able to get the support that they need, and that the system isn't becoming kind of clogged up by people who don't necessarily need that same kind of support. But I think, there are a lot of factors. We've talked about the pandemic, we've talked about social media and smartphones. There are a lot of factors which help to explain why young adults, might have more issues around their mental health than we've seen in previous generations. And I also think there's something positive around the fact that actually we're more often able to recognise some of these issues and name them and look for help, even if that's not necessarily, perhaps the NHS and kind of medical treatment isn't the right route. But if there are other options, it's a positive thing to be able to address that. And obviously, the government is talking about this a lot in the context of unemployment and the workforce, and tackling these things at an earlier point before people end up on waiting lists for NHS help or feel they have to seek that medical support is only a positive thing as well.
All right. Rhiannon Evans at Mumsnet, thank you for sharing your thoughts.
Thank you.
Now, the Church of Sweden has issued a warning about nuns from a convent in Minsk who are thought to have links to the Russian security services. The members of St. Elizabeth Convent have been selling their handicrafts at markets across Europe, and a few years ago they hoisted a talk by a Russian security operative who described his time in Syria, in Chechnya and in Ukraine. We can get the thoughts of Christina Smith on this from the Civil Preparedness Department at the Church of Sweden. Hello, Christina.
Hello.
Hi. It's a remarkable story. Tell us about your concerns, your worries then about these Belarusian nuns.
Well, it's mainly because they are supporting the Russian aggression against Ukraine, and we don't want to do anything that supports that. So it's, for us, it's basically their marketing of goods that in support of Russia.
Okay, I'll just so interested in what you mean by that. The Belarusian nuns then are selling goods. I've had a look at their website, an enormous variety of merchandise on there. Some of it's really rather expensive, and they're selling some of this merchandise at markets, which are supported by your church.
Exactly, it's like the parishes in Sweden this time of year arrange a lot of Christmas markets, and they have had a cooperation for a long time with this convent. And since we found out their support of the Russian aggression, we would prefer that they don't get invited to our parishes to sell their goods there.
Well, I mean, I quite understand that a lot of people would object to the appearance of a market, in a local market, of people who are supporting the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Is that your entire concern, that you're upset by the fact that your fellow nuns, are supporting the invasion, or are you suggesting they're doing more? They're giving somehow material support to the Russian cause?
No. Our concern is the support monetarily, and we would advise against any organization supporting the Russian aggression. So right. For us, it's minor that it happens to be nuns.
Oh no! Well, then what is the evidence that they're using money that they're gaining from their selling merchandise in Swedish markets, including ones you support, to support the Russian cause? I mean, how do you know they're supporting the Russian invasion with the money they're getting?
Well, we are not an intelligence service, so we don't have our own sources.
No.
We rely on reports that we get through the media and from government agencies.
And tell me a little bit about what you've heard about them doing that.
Say again?
Tell me what your evidence is gathered from those agencies or other sources.
It's that their archpriest, Lemja Shonak, has been publicly supporting the Russian aggression. You can find that in open source information. Mm-hmm. And also their support in general for the Russian worldview, but the Russian, the Ruski Mir,
mm-hmm. Okay, and so look, your concern is very, very clear, and you've been trying to warn convents, other parts of your church, not to engage with these Belarusian nuns who are sympathetic to Russia in the invasion of Ukraine. How do they respond to your warnings? Do they agree with you? Do they agree that these Belarusian nuns should not be in these markets, or does anyone argue back and disagree?
No, the only parish where we found out that they have been this year said that they will not invite them again.
Right, so your warning has been taken up in that sense. And this action that you've taken in putting out this warning, we're talking about it, we're obviously interested. Has it caught on as a story in Sweden and elsewhere?
Yes, it has gotten quite a big blow up in the Swedish media, and the spy connection has spiraled a lot, which was not something that came from us, but from other talking heads in Sweden.
All right. Christina Smith from the Civil Preparedness Department at the Church of Sweden on that, well, really quite remarkable story. Thank you for joining us. More coming up here on Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the times.
It's 5 o'clock. I'm John Pienaar on Times Radio, and here are the headlines. The Foreign Secretary says Vladimir Putin is still an active threat to British citizens after he was found responsible for the death of a woman in the wake of the Salisbury poisonings. And 4 people have been arrested in East Sussex on suspicion of far-right terror offences. And coming up, a former US ambassador to NATO will be talking to us about today's Ukraine talks in Miami. We're going to be looking at the British government money heading, the American government money, Donald Trump government money heading towards his son Donald Trump Jr.'s business, or one that he's supporting, and a big decision for the Eurovision Song Contest. And we're going to be checking in on the latest in the polls with Luke Trill from More in Common.
This is Times Radio.
Now the news with Tom Noonan.
Good afternoon.
across the UK on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app, online and on your smart speaker. Quality journalism, analysis and opinion that speaks for itself. John Pienaar at Drive on Times Radio.
It is good to have your company on Drive on Times Radio. I'm John Pienaar. Ukraine's friends in Europe, in NATO and here in the UK are getting more serious now about helping to face Vladimir Putin and the lethal threat Putin's Russia presents to the West. The European Union's getting closer to handing Ukraine an enormous loan, more of a gift of some 90 billion euros, enough to see Ukraine through 2 more years. Britain's chipping in another 8 billion. That is game-changing money. And the UK has also prescribed the Russian spy agency, the GRU, and called in the Russian ambassador after today's report blaming Putin directly for ordering the murder of the Russian defector Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia. Now, I should probably add that when I mention Ukraine's friends and supporters, can I really, do you think, include the United States and President Trump in that list? Donald Trump told the world this week that, the US-Russia talks went reasonably well. They were reasonably good, he said, though they'd achieved nothing. He said Vladimir Putin would like to end the war, which may well be true, so long as the war ends in defeat for Ukraine, which he refuses to recognise as a country. Still, Ukraine's envoys are talking to President Trump's envoys in the USA later, and we're going to be watching for news from Miami. Now, what Ukraine and Ukraine's friends want and need is for Trump to stop giving Putin credit for talking peace and to put a lot more pressure on him through tougher sanctions against Russia to make peace happen. We're talking about that. And by the way, speaking of the Trump administration, I wonder what you make of the news that a startup company backed by Donald Trump's son, Donald Trump Jr., has been given a $620 million funding deal by President Trump's Department of War, as it's been renamed by President Trump. Well, that's obviously good news, isn't it, for someone? Now, Representative Jim Himes, the senior Democrat on a congressional committee, says a closed-door briefing on September's double-tap strike in the Caribbean, where a Venezuelan boat was destroyed and survivors in the water were killed, was one of the most troubling things he's seen. Admiral Bradley, the commander of the operation, told lawmakers there was no kill-them-all order and urged that the video be released publicly. What do you think of this story? Send me a text, 87222, start with the word Times, or a tweet to @TimesRadio. First then, let me now welcome to Drive Kurt Volker, former US ambassador. Hello to you, Ambassador.
Hello, good to be with you, John.
It's good to have you here. So, look, President Trump, as I say, he described the talks between Jared Kushner and Steve Witkoff on the US side and Putin as having gone reasonably well. Do you think those talks went reasonably well, Ambassador?
Well, in the sense that there was no surrender of Ukraine or by Ukraine, that didn't happen. So I suppose in that sense, that's good. But there was really no surprise to what happened in those talks. After the 28-point plan, which had been terribly one-sided towards Russia, was transformed by Marco Rubio and the Ukrainians and Europeans into something reasonable, of course, Putin rejected that.
Right.
And that's exactly what happened in Moscow. He simply said, no, we want everything.
So, of course, you acknowledge then in diplomatic language that at those talks in Moscow, nothing was achieved. Russian demands remained unchanged, and Putin threw in a warning that he was ready to go to war with Europe for good measure. And he also, as the Secretary-General of NATO pointed out, posed in military fatigues. There's nothing encouraging about any of that, is there? And should President Trump recognise that and act accordingly?
Well, we've been saying this for many, many months now, that we all know that Vladimir Putin started this war. He's the only one that wants this war. Ukraine doesn't want it. Europe doesn't want it. America doesn't want it. And indeed, Ukraine's ready to have a ceasefire right now. But Russia is not. So the only thing to do is to put pressure on Putin financially, economically, militarily, to get him to the point where he also feels like he needs a ceasefire.
Yes.
And that's been true since the first day of the Trump administration. It's true today still.
Well, I mean that's just transparently true, is it not? And meanwhile, beneath all of that, well, President Trump argues that his prime concern is to stop people being killed, which is a perfectly laudable aim. It is also perfectly fair to argue that he's not doing nearly enough to bring that about. The American policy prior to the second Trump term was to do more. It was to provide weapons to Ukraine, to support NATO more fully. And now America is selling arms, not giving arms to Ukraine, and taking a neutral stand at best. As an American, as a diplomat, as someone who wants to see America uphold traditional, standard, historic American values, this must be distressing to you.
Well, it's really very, very frustrating because, you go back to those phone calls that Steve Witkoff had with Ushakov and with Dmitriev. And here he was treating Russia as a partner of the United States when Russia is the aggressor that is raping and killing and so forth and has started this war in Ukraine. But treating Russia as a partner and viewing Ukraine as something just to be decided about, something to be divvied up.
Yes.
That's really very offensive because we not only have, a set of moral issues here about war and war crimes and abduction of children and so forth. We also have interests, and we have an interest in not seeing an aggressor rewarded and fueling the fires of further war in Europe. So I think those calls were very distressing. Now, Trump, I think he, as you said, I think he genuinely wants there to be an end to the war, stop to the killing, just no more killing. And what he refuses to accept is that the only reason there is killing going on is because of Russia's continuing war against Ukraine. So I know he wants a deal with Putin. I know he wants business deals on the back end of that. But if you want to get to that point of ending the killing, you've got to get Putin to stop it.
All right. Ambassador, America is, of course, such an important player in the global balance of power, such an important part of NATO, a pillar of the Western alliance, which is why we're so keen to talk to someone such as you as often as we are. But we see a curious situation in Washington. I'm keen to get your analysis. The president takes the position that we're discussing now. Congress has always been a player in this too, and there are voices on both sides of the aisle in Congress who want to see a much more assertive position, American policy position. There's even legislation in Congress to punish countries dealing in trading with Russia. Do you see any hope of that legislation, which is being put forward by, well, among others, people like Lindsey Graham, who's a hawk on this subject? Do you see any hope in that legislation, any hope in Congress taking a more assertive position?
Well, I do up to a point. So that legislation that you're referring to, it's secondary sanctions, secondary tariffs perhaps as well, on countries that are trading in Russian oil and gas or entities that are trading in Russian oil and gas. I think there is great frustration that Trump is not taking a tougher line on Putin, and this would give him the tools to say, here, do this. Now, that doesn't mean that it obligates Trump to do so. No. There would be a waiver clause in there, and therefore, I think it's more likely that the Senate would indeed pass it because there is still the option for Trump to decide how to play that card.
Yes.
Now, part of the dynamic that we should be talking about here is midterm elections and the perceptions of Republicans, perceptions of President Trump. For all of this year, Republicans in Congress have not wanted to distance themselves from President Trump at all. He's been very strong with the Republican base, the MAGA base. They need that support. They need the votes. They need the Republican National Committee's financing. So they have been reluctant to step away. As we see President Trump's approval rating go down in recent weeks, if that becomes a sustained trend, that's also something that will give Republicans some reason to want to show a little daylight with what Trump is doing. Now, it may not be on foreign policy. It might be, say, on tariffs or on inflation. But I think that that dynamic may kick in next year if it looks like they're going to be losing in midterm elections by not having any coattails to ride on.
That's an important point, isn't it? It's fair to summarize what you said, is it not, in this sort of simple, crude way, by saying as President Trump's lame duck status starts to grow, well, then more traditional American ideas of security, including on the Republican side, will grow too.
Well, I don't think those ideas ever disappeared in the Republican Party or in Congress. Only in President Trump and that MAGA fraction of the Republican Party, but they are in power right now. And I think that you will see those more traditional ideas sustained throughout the Trump presidency and beyond. Now, his lame duck status, it's interesting you mentioned that. I think that President Trump is very conscious about the possibility of becoming a lame duck and wanting to do everything possible to mitigate that. I think that's why he talks about a third term. And I think that's why he's setting up a competition for the Republican nomination between Rubio and Vance, where he would be the decider, because that will continue to make him relevant.
I mean, before you leave us, Ambassador, I'm really grateful to you as always for coming on. I'm going to move on in a moment and talk about another interesting story in the United States, which concerns Donald Trump Jr., of course, the president's son, who is behind an investment fund, and a company supported by that fund has been given a $600 million contract by the Pentagon, which raises obvious concerns about conflicts of interest and preferential treatment. I mean, do you share those concerns?
Well, I do, and I'm more concerned about the international dynamics. That's one where there are Pentagon processes, there's contracting processes. The selection criteria ought to be transparent. If there are questions about that, they should be investigated. And it gives the appearance that the president's family is benefiting directly from contracts from the Pentagon. You'd have to ask about that. You'd have to wonder about that, and it's certainly not a good look. What I'm more concerned about is the international dimension, where you have companies associated with the Trumps, with Jared Kushner, with Steve Witkoff, that are doing deals internationally at the same time that we are trying to engage foreign leaders. So there's a bit more of a concern that they are buying their way in and out of things.
All right, good to get your concerns interesting for us. Ambassador Kurt Volker, thank you.
Thank you.
Well, now let's turn to the story I mentioned there. The U.S. Defense Department having agreed to a loan of $620 million to a company called Vulcan. It's a startup. It is involved in the rare earth minerals trade. 3 months ago, Donald Trump Jr., the president's son, his capital firm, 1789, invested in that company. At least 4 of its portfolio of companies have won contracts from the Trump administration this year. And the Pentagon is insisting neither Trump Jr. nor 1789 were involved in the loan negotiations. Let's talk to Joe Miller, who's Washington correspondent for the FT. Joe, welcome.
Oh, thanks. Nice to be with you.
Thank you. Well, tell us more about this loan to a company which is backed by the president's son, and a huge loan.
Yeah, as you mentioned there, an enormous loan. We believe the biggest loan given out by this part of the Pentagon, called the Office of Strategic Capital, so far under this administration. And we have to say highly unusual, because it's gone to a company that, when it was bidding for this contract, presumably on the merits of its technology, it was already publicly known that it was backed by a company which counts Donald Trump Jr. as one of its board members and partners. And so, this is part of a pattern that we have noticed in recent months, that the Pentagon, which under Donald Trump is trying to be more open to innovative companies, and it makes, is not shy about the fact that it's going to look beyond the traditional defense contractors and try and find innovative companies. But many of those innovative companies, or at least some of them, have links to the Trump family and to Donald Trump Jr. in particular. And, it certainly raises questions about conflicts of interest, even though Donald Trump Jr. and the Pentagon say that there was nothing untoward about these awards, and they were awarded, based on the value for money and the merits of the companies involved.
Well, Joe, one would imagine that when it comes to any significant contract, let alone one of this size, there would be processes, there would be safeguards and guardrails, just to be sure that there was no reason to suspect nepotism or preferential treatment. So were there such processes, and were they followed?
That's what the Pentagon insists did happen, that there was nothing untoward, that the processes were followed. And indeed, we did not uncover any evidence. I think it's important to point out that Don Jr. himself went to the Pentagon and said, please give this company a contract or anything like that. But, nonetheless, it is true to say that this company was known to be a 1789 portfolio company.
Yeah.
And, when research was being done by the procurement officers, no doubt they knew who the funders were, I'm sure. And so whether that played into their decision, they claim it didn't, and we have to take them at their word, but it's certainly highly unusual. And there isn't really a precedent for that in previous administrations, certainly not at this scale.
And it is true to say, just as a matter of fact, isn't it, that at the beginning of this administration, Don Jr., the president's son, did have a role in advising on Pentagon appointments.
He's certainly been in the inner circle. He was at Mar-a-Lago during the transition period after Trump got elected and before he took office. And, he's part of a group of people who advise, Trump. Trump is known to rely on his family's advice a lot, and he's incredibly well connected in the, so-called MAGA world, and indeed now in the venture capital world. So, he is someone who is known to a lot of the power players and whose, pet projects and investments are known to everyone who cares to read about them. Really, it's that, one thing you have to say about the Trump family is they're not hiding any of this. It's all out there in public if you want to have a look.
Yeah.
We've just put two and two together and what's publicly available and written about it.
All right, Joe Miller, the Washington correspondent for the Financial Times. Thank you.
Thank you.
Good to have you with us. Now, coming up, we'll be looking at the latest in the opinion polls with Luke Trill from More in Common, and we're going to be talking about what will be a big decision for the Eurovision Song Contest. And next, an inquiry into the Salisbury poisonings has, exposed, if it needed exposing, the ruthlessness of Vladimir Putin. We're going to be talking to a former ambassador to Moscow. It's at 5:20. I'm John Pienaar on Times Radio Drive.
John Pienaar at Drive on Times Radio.
Now, the Russian intelligence agency, the GRU, a successor to the notorious KGB, has been sanctioned after the publication of a report into the death of Dawn Sturgis, who was killed by the Novichok nerve agent in the Salisbury poisonings. The chair of the inquiry, Lord Hughes, found the attempted killing of former spy Sergei Skripal amounted to a public demonstration of Russian power, and the orders must have come from Putin himself. Times Radio's Ollie Cole is here with me in the studio. Good to have you here, Ollie. Can you just tell us about the report and what it made of the murders?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, what we learned sort of unequivocally was that it must have been Putin himself who ordered this at the highest level in terms of the attempted assassination of the Skripals. Now, of course, Dawn Sturgis then got caught up in that. She had been sort of bin dipping, is what they call it, where you go through bins to try and find things to sell, and her husband had been doing that and found the contaminated bottle of perfume at that point. Then, of course, we know that Dawn Sturgis sadly died not long after that. A few things came from that. One was whether any of this could have been avoided, the attack on Sergei Skripal and therefore the death of Dawn Sturgis. Now, the conclusion that the inquiry has come to is that actually at the time Sergei Skripal wasn't seen as someone who was under active threat by the Russians, wasn't sort of being actively monitored. Police in the area weren't being kept up to date consistently on his place. But the inquiry finds that actually that was the right thing to do. And essentially, the only way that this could have been avoided is if Skripal himself was given a totally new identity and essentially told, don't contact any of your family ever again and cut yourself off from the life you've had before. So there are some instances here where there was an inevitability, but the inquiry also did find failings in terms of some intelligence sharing, in terms of how emergency services responded to this in quite a mixed way, and the fact that the bottle was found during bin dipping, and actually there was no alert sent out by the authorities to say, don't, be careful around trash, be careful around these sorts of items, until after Dawn Sturgis herself had contact with that Novichok and then died.
Right. What about the family, the Sturgis family? What have they said?
Well, they've said this answers some questions, but they are quite clear that they don't think it goes far enough. They expected the inquiry. In its terms of reference, it says that the inquiry should find what went wrong and then suggest recommendations as to how to put it right and ensure that it doesn't happen again. They say that's exactly what they wanted out of this, to make sure that, sadly, after the loss of Dawn, this could never happen on UK soil again. However, in that inquiry, there are no recommendations whatsoever. Now, the UK government have taken some action. They've sanctioned the GRU, as you said. They've pulled in the Moscow ambassador to the UK. But, they haven't actually had any recommendations from this inquiry to enact, and the family of Dawn Sturgis aren't particularly happy about that.
Right, Ollie Cole, thank you. Now, let us get the thoughts of Laurie Bristow, former British ambassador to Russia at the time of the Salisbury poisonings. Welcome to you.
Good evening.
Good to have you here. Tell me, what did you think of this report?
Sure. Well, I should just start by saying that before I come on to the report itself, for those of us who worked on this issue at the time, we have to come back to the fact that a completely innocent bystander called Dawn Sturgis was killed as a result of what the Russian state did. And a number of other bystanders, people who were just going about their lives or their jobs, were gravely injured by it. So the report itself, I should start, of course, by saying that I left government service a few years ago, so I can comment on it, but if you want a government position, you need to ask someone from the government. But what the report tells us is something pretty fundamental about the way the Russian state operates under Mr. Putin. So a decision was taken by the GRU, the military intelligence, to conduct an assassination operation in the UK against somebody that they had traded under the spy swap in 2010. They sent out a team to do that with a very, very advanced nerve agent, a military nerve agent. They painted it on his door handle, and then they went back home. They dumped the rest of the material, it seems, with no particular care about who might pick that up or what might happen to them if they did. And then when they were challenged on this, as the facts started to come to light, they lied and they lied and they lied about their role in this.
Yes, I mean, we're talking, of course, about murderous agents of a murderous regime serving a murderous leader in Vladimir Putin. So against that clear and obvious background, summoning the Russian ambassador into the Foreign Office and prescribing the GRU Secret Intelligence Service, are we talking about a futile gesture here?
Well, clearly something needed to happen today on the publication of the report. And of course, it's not only the GRU's attack on Sergei Skripal that caused the death of Dawn Sturgis. That's not the whole story here. So right at the beginning of my time as ambassador in Moscow in 2016, Lord Owen published his report on the murder of Alexander Litvinenko in the UK, in London, using radioactive polonium by the FSB, the successor to the KGB. And if we're talking about the Russian state's approach to civilian casualties, we do need to look at what Russia is doing in actively, deliberately targeting civilians in Ukraine right now.
Yes.
So in terms of response, I think the right way to understand what's been done today is about responding over time to an escalating threat from Russia across a whole broad range of issues, whether it's poisonings in the UK, or it's sabotage, or whether it's use of disinformation to corrupt and undermine our institutions, and trying to find ways to impose a real cost on the Russian state for that. So the main reaction after the poisonings in 2018 were that I personally went into the foreign ministry and demanded an explanation of what had happened here. And when no such explanation was forthcoming, we 3 Russian officials from the embassy in London, and alongside NATO and European Union colleagues, we expelled over 150 Russian intelligence officers from Europe. That caused systemic damage to the Russian intelligence agencies. So I think it's important to understand the wider context in which today's measures were taken.
Indeed. Laurie Bristow, former British ambassador to Russia, thank you. Now, all that you want to know about that inquiry, you can see now live at thetimes.com. And do keep sharing your thoughts. Send me a text, send me a tweet, send me a voice note on WhatsApp on 0333 003 2353. We'll talk more a little later in the programme. Now then, Eurovision. Let's talk for a moment about Eurovision. Organisers are meeting in Geneva are deciding on whether or not to ban Israel from taking part in the 2026 contest. Now, Ireland, as well as Spain, Slovenia and the Netherlands, have all said they will boycott Eurovision if Israel is allowed to take part. Germany says it may boycott if they're banned. Now, the European Broadcasting Union has changed the voting system over allegations of interference from the Israeli government. Callum Rowe is a Eurovision expert from the Euro Trip podcast. Hi to you, Callum.
Hi, John. How are you?
I'm well. So an awful lot of people are going to be listening to this and watching the way this plays out. Tell us a bit more. What's going to be on the table at the discussion later?
Well, it's a very timely conversation, John, that we're having, because in my email inbox that I've just received, forgive me for looking away, but I've just received an email from the Dutch broadcaster Avrotros. The Dutch broadcaster 2 months ago threatened to boycott the Eurovision Song Contest in Vienna next year should Israel be allowed to continue to participate in the competition. And the Dutch broadcaster Avrotros has just announced that it says the Netherlands will not participate in Eurovision next year. It's saying in there that it's been having some conversations from a wide range of its stakeholders and member broadcasters from across Europe, and the Dutch broadcaster has decided that it will not go to Vienna next year and participate in Eurovision because of what it says has been decided will be the inclusion of Israel next year. That is just broken in the last 2 or 3 minutes, John.
Right. And look, now we also have Ireland, Spain and Slovenia also saying they will boycott the competition if Israel is allowed in. Will they be walking away too?
Yeah, obviously this is just broken in the past few moments. It's incredibly fast moving. But those broadcasters that you just mentioned, from Ireland, from Slovenia, from Spain's broadcaster RTVE, their public service broadcaster, a little bit like the BBC here in the UK, they have been adamant, they have been steadfast in their view that Israel should not be participating. And I think we can quite safely say that if the Dutch broadcaster has decided to leave the competition, the broadcasters in Ireland, in Spain, in Slovenia, and perhaps in other countries like Iceland will be following suit very shortly. I think it will be moving very quickly over the next few hours and days.
Right. So, I mean, there are strong objections just to the participation of Israel there. What about the allegations of Israeli government interference? What do they really amount to? What's the evidence for that?
So this came from the contest which was held in Basel in Switzerland earlier this year. The Israeli participant Yuval Raphael, she won the public vote at Eurovision. The voting is split 50-50 between us watching at home and some professional juries from each of the participating countries. The Israeli act overwhelmingly won the public vote, and in the days and the weeks after the competition was held in Basel in May this year, the EBU, that's the organisers of the competition Eurovision, the EBU's own fact-checking service Spotlight did an investigation and found conclusive evidence that an Israeli government-funded advertising agency had pumped millions and millions of dollars into online advertising campaigns to rally the voters from across Europe to vote for Israel as many times as possible. So in that contest earlier this year, people at home could vote up to 20 times for whatever countries they wanted. The Eurovision organisers have reduced that number from 20 to 10 for next year in Vienna as a way of reassuring the other broadcasters that compete that the voting can't be manipulated. But it appears that that doesn't really go far enough for some broadcasters.
Yeah, a mere 10 votes a person. So getting a bit closer to what we sort of generally understand to be a democratic and fair vote. Callum Rowe, thank you so much. Good to have your input on that. Now, after 6, we've got Pienaar and friends. Adam Bolton is going to be joining me, and of course, Kirsty Buchanan, former number 10 advisor. And we're going to be talking polls with Luke Trill from More in Common in just a moment. And hearing some news on the US Secretary of War Pete Hegseth's conduct over the second strike on one of those Venezuelan boats in the Caribbean, which killed survivors of an initial strike justified as attempting to take out drug traffickers. Huge controversy in Washington. Now, 5:34, let's get the news with Tom Noonan.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. John Pienaar at Drive on Times Radio.
Now, you can make a difference to people's lives this Christmas by supporting the Times and the Sunday Times Christmas Appeal, partnering with the charities World Bicycle Relief, Kissing It Better and Switchback. It is a great opportunity to support those in need this festive season. So to donate, please find the time to visit thetimes.com/Christmas Appeal or call 0151 286 1594. That's 0151 286 1594. So as we've been discussing, the US Secretary of War, formerly known as Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth, is still facing questions over the bombing of a stricken ship in Venezuelan waters. A senior admiral faces questions at a congressional committee hearing behind closed doors today. Now, Representative Jim Himes, the senior Democrat on that committee, says a closed-door briefing on September's double-tap strike, as it's called in the Caribbean, was one of the most troubling things he's seen. Admiral Bradley told lawmakers there was no kill-them-all order and urged that the video and the records be released publicly. The former Times defence editor Michael Evans told me more.
When you have an operation like this, there are discussions pre-mission between the military commander and his closest aides, and to make sure that all the orders are well understood. This is recorded, so that there are recorded tapes of these conversations, all of which will have outlined what the mission's about, what needs to be done, and what authority they have to do it. There's also a video available of the strike that killed these two survivors. And there are other text messages which were sent to the people who were doing the strikes, which is the SEAL Team 6, who are operating the drones. So all in all, there's a huge amount of evidence that will demonstrate who was doing what and why and what authority was given.
And so, I mean, should the expectation be, and Bradley is giving closed session evidence in Congress today, should it be that responsibility for the killing of the survivors in the Caribbean Sea is going to land very squarely in the lap of the Secretary for War, as he's now called?
Well, the Secretary for War, as you say, gives the broad authority to carry out operations, but very often it's left to the actual commander on the scene to carry out missions as he sees fit, within the parameters set by the Defense Secretary and his military superiors. So it's not easy to say, well, he did this because it was his own choice. He does have the authority to make decisions, but within these parameters. And I think the problem with this whole operation is that there has been a degree of confusion and some bewilderment over whether these actions are legitimate in the first place. That has nothing to do with Admiral Bradley, by the way, who obviously has given his orders and he carries them out. But there is some concern that these operations against these drug boats it veers towards the illegal. Well, that's denied totally by both the White House and the Pentagon. Pete Hegseth, as you know, as the Defense Secretary, has the power to order these things, and he ordered this operation, which is called Southern Spear, and they've had, I think, it's 21 attacks on boats, and more than 80 people have been killed so far.
Okay, and are you right that in the Pentagon, among senior commanders, there's a certain amount of unrest, of dissatisfaction with the way this whole thing has been presented? Can you tell me more about that? What are they upset about?
Well, what they're upset about is the fact that both the Defense Secretary and the White House publicly at a press conference have said the man who was responsible for killing these two survivors was Admiral Frank Mitch Bradley. So basically, if you're a uniformed officer in the Pentagon or elsewhere, you're saying to yourself, great, this is a political operation, if you like, politically authorized operation, and they're singling out the military commander on the scene for taking action, which a lot of people are claiming is the equivalent of a war crime, because instead of saving survivors, you're killing them.
Right. So the high military worry is that the Admiral, he did his job, Mitch Bradley, but the White House and the political masters of the Pentagon are trying to shake off and shirk their responsibility. Well,
I mean, that seems to be what is going on right now. I think there is a degree of resentment about it. And I think Admiral Bradley in particular is, as I say in my piece today, is a highly revered commander. He's been in special forces, special operations for a lot of his life, and I, people regard him as an extremely excellent commander who would certainly not carry out an order if he felt it was a war crime.
Both then the Pentagon High Command and Admiral Bradley himself and the White House and Pete Hegseth are on the same page that the second strike on that Caribbean boat, that could be justified under the law. The dispute or the tension is over who takes responsibility for that act.
Well, if the second strike is legitimate and legal and fits with all international laws, then it doesn't really matter who ordered it, whether it's Pete Hegseth himself, and it wouldn't be, and that's not how it works, or the military commander, which is what normally happens, then it doesn't matter, because if they've got justification for this attack, which they certainly seem to think they have, then the argument comes to an end. There are going to be justified reasons, and I'm sure Admiral Bradley will have with him the recorded tapes and other electronic evidence which will show that he took the decision for the right reasons.
The Pentagon High Command, the Admiral who was in charge of the case, the Defense Secretary, now War Secretary, and the White House in its positions in news conferences recently, they all seem to accept that nothing was done wrongly in killing the survivors of the boat. And you say there's documented evidence that might support the case for striking the boat a second time. But the resentment in the Pentagon was with this political row raging, with accusations that crimes were committed. The Pentagon are insisting that the White House and the master of the Pentagon, Pete Hegseth, also bear their ultimate political responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, if you're the head of the Pentagon, everything stops in your in tray, as it were, and out tray. You're the guy in charge, and you have to take ultimate responsibility. I don't think,
and that's what the Pentagon commanders want to be seen to happen. Now, when it comes to Hegseth himself, he's not in the safest of positions, is he? And there was a leak of that operational information on social media and other things too.
Yes, he's had a pretty rough time since he became Defense Secretary. He has a certain style about him which doesn't necessarily suit a lot of people, both within the Pentagon itself and certainly in Congress, or particularly amongst the Democrats. But now also, I think some Republicans are also getting a little bit worried about his style of management and leadership. This guy's a very forceful character. He may be a former Fox News presenter, but he's taken to this job with in a sort of high-profile way. It wasn't that long ago when you may remember, he addressed 800 generals and admirals who were summoned to the US from all around the world to hear his views about how the Pentagon and all the armed services must become more warrior-like, and in which he actually said that he didn't have much sympathy for rules of engagement, which he felt rather restricted this lethal warrior image that he wanted to portray and to develop. So he is a strong and high personality sort of character, and I think he has had as I said, a pretty rough time. And there are people, no doubt, who would prefer that he was no longer the Defense Secretary.
And that was Michael Evans, the former defence editor at The Times. Now, coming up in a quarter of an hour after 6 o'clock, Pienaar and Friends, when I'm going to be joined by Adam Bolton, my Times Radio colleague, and by the former political advisor to Downing Street, Kirsty Buchanan. We've got plenty of things to talk about on the show because we always do. Let me just pass on to you now some developing news, because Spain has now announced that it is joining the Netherlands in boycotting the Eurovision Song Contest. Now, who will be next? Ireland. You'd imagine they could be next on the list in protest at Israel being allowed to compete in Eurovision. Slovakia have been unhappy, and I wonder where this is going to go. This is going to be big news, well, for I imagine the millions upon millions who are passionately interested in Eurovision just on its own, but also as a developing story, as a maelstrom, as it were, of European popular culture surrounding Israel and the situation of that country. We're going to be getting you the latest on Eurovision and what is happening to it and what is left of it in the next hour of the programme on Pienaar and Friends. It's now 5:47 and I'm John Pienaar on Times Radio.
John Pienaar at Drive on Times Radio.
A new list of the most mispronounced words of 2025 has been released. And we can talk about that now. New York's incoming mayor, Zohran Mamdani, the Paris Louvre Museum. Do you notice my pronunciation of Louvre there? It was on the top of Babel's annual ranking after both names repeatedly caused trip-ups for presenters and politicians. There are other words too. We can talk a bit more about it with Rob Drummond, the Professor of Sociolinguistics at Manchester Metropolitan University. Hi to you, Rob.
Hello there.
The existence of this list, it might actually be practically interesting, useful news. But tell me, what are the most mispronounced words?
Well, so some of these, like you say, some names, some famous names actually. I noticed that Denzel Washington is on there, and he describes his name because, of course, I think originally it was Denzel, and then I think the story was that his mum then kind of changed it to Denzel to make him stand out a bit.
Right.
But I think it's quite interesting with names, because I think when it's somebody's name, the rule really is it's however they pronounce it. I think that's the thing. When it's somebody's own name, it's up to them.
Yeah, you can't be more right than the person themselves, that's for sure. I've always called him Denzel, by the way, but there we go. Maybe I should change that. And what about apart from sort of proper names, what are the names that most often got wrong?
I think on this list, there's things like Glyndŵr National Park, which I think, because it's a Welsh word. I mean, that's the thing. People don't always know exactly how to pronounce things when it's from a language other than their own. And so, of course, we're going to struggle. I think as long as people have a good go, and as long as people are willing to learn what the more correct pronunciation is, I think it's fine. But I'm also a little bit wary of people who go around telling people how they should or shouldn't pronounce things, especially if they take glee in that. But
what about common words, commonly used words, which are commonly mistaken?
I think, I don't know if there are. I think people get upset with things like, I don't know, espressos.
Espressos? How do you get that?
Yeah, that comes a lot. Because they try to add extra sounds in there. So
how can you add extra sounds to the word espresso?
Espresso. People think it's espresso.
Okay, but that's just wrong, isn't it? Yeah.
Well,
that's not a mispronunciation.
It is wrong, according to the spelling, and it is wrong. But I think we need to be a bit more. I personally think we need to be a bit more tolerant when people say these things. I don't think it really matters. It doesn't interfere with communication. Yeah. I imagine a few people kind of getting quite cross about that. But
I get the Louvre being mispronounced, but if you're too obvious about pronouncing Louvre, you just look like a pretentious twit, don't you? I mean, most people would say something closer to it, Louvre. You don't need that. You don't need the necessarily.
No, and that's fine. And I think a lot of these words become anglicized, in our case anyway, and in different languages. That's absolutely fine. They'll become pronounced in a way that suits that particular language, because of course different languages have different sets of sounds anyway. So there are particular sounds in some languages that we don't have in English, and vice versa.
Okay, I need to find your list. I'm sure it'll help me out with some hole that I didn't know I was even going to fall into. Rob Drummond at Metropolitan Manchester University. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Another statement for you on the developing story of Eurovision. It's from Ireland. It says, following today's EBU Winter General Assembly in Geneva, at which Israel's participation in the 2026 Eurovision Song Contest was confirmed, RTE's position remains unchanged. RTE will not participate in the 2026 Eurovision Song Contest, nor will RTE broadcast the competition. The statement goes on, RTE feels that Ireland's participation remains unconscionable given the appalling loss of lives in Gaza and the humanitarian crisis there, which continues to put the lives of so many civilians at risk. RTE says the statement remains deeply concerned by the targeted killing of journalists in Gaza during the conflict and the continued denial of access to international journalists to the territory. Now, it should be, I think, said by way of useful context, that Ireland has been deeply, I suppose, vocal and critical of Israel, certainly Israel's position in relation to the Middle East, but also the participation in the Eurovision Song Contest for a while. This can't be called a complete surprise, but I think maybe we can anticipate this story, a big European popular culture story, developing into a significant political story in Europe and, frankly, globally, given the enormous audience of Eurovision. We're just at the beginning of a new chapter of that tale, and we're going to be following it. Let's talk about it in just a moment on Pienaar and Friends after 6 o'clock. First, though, let us talk to Luke Trill at 5:54.
The Polling Station with Luke Trill on Times Radio.
Welcome as always, Luke. So let us look at the latest opinion polls. Should we start with Reform, and what are your latest numbers on those telling you?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. If you look across the polls at the moment, it appears that Reform might have hit a bit of a plateau and may even be starting to tumble down a little bit in their poll ratings across the past week. We've certainly seen across different pollsters, Reform be down, not hugely, but 1, 2, 3 points in polls, flat in other polls. So it does look like, for now at least, we are past the period when they kept on rising. Now, of course, that could change in the future, but they have hit a bit of a plateau. And it looks like part of the reason for that is that the focus has been so much on the economy. And when the focus is on the economy, as opposed to particularly immigration or crime, it is harder for Reform to cut through. It lends itself more to a typical Tory-Labour clash, as we saw at the budget.
Right, and just as you ask whether or not maybe Reform UK have hit something of a ceiling, have they also hit something of a floor, or could this slight deterioration lead to something worse for Reform?
Yeah, I mean, there is no doubt that, there is now a range across pollsters. So, some, such as YouGov, have them as low as 26% now. Now, that's still a clear lead over other parties. It's around a 7-point lead. Others have them higher, but even pollsters like Find Out Now, which have tended to be more bullish on Reform, have them at 31%, which is down from their peak of 36%. So definitely some changes going on. And the other story, which appears to be happening, is the Conservatives perhaps enjoying a bit of a resurgence. Again, across a number of pollsters this week, the Conservative share ticking up a little bit. And in particular, we found, and other pollsters, that Kemi Badenoch's approval has jumped up following that budget response.
Jumped up? It sounds like a big change.
It does. So we've had, she's actually in our approval tracker at -15. Now, that might not sound great, but it's actually her best result this year. Bear in mind, Keir Starmer is way back on -47, Nigel Farage -11. So she's just behind Farage now, having been stuck at -22 or around there for quite some time. So that is a bump. And we also found, we asked people who watched the budget, so they either watched the entirety or some of the budget, and they were much more likely to say that they thought Kemi Badenoch performed well in that budget response than performed badly, and more likely to say she performed better than the Chancellor. Obviously, some people were a little bit squeamish, so it was quite a personal response from Kemi Badenoch, but it looks like amongst those who watched it, they liked what she had to say.
OK, now we've been talking in the last 24, 48 hours about the European Union and the government's relationship with the EU and search for a better trading deal, post-Brexit trading deal. Tell us a bit more about the latest currency in public opinion.
So we've known for a while now that it's actually a majority of the public think that the government should negotiate a closer relationship with the European Union. That doesn't necessarily mean going back in or anything as dramatic as joining the customs union or single market, but they do want us to be cooperating with Europe more. And one of the things which is driving that is that when you ask the public, was Brexit the right decision for Britain or the wrong decision? We've now got 50% who say it was the wrong decision for Britain, just 33% the right decision. But one word of caution here, which is important, is when you ask people, was Brexit, has Brexit worked well? Could it have worked well if politicians had handled it better? Or was it never going to work? Actually, the plurality, 47%, are in that group where they say Brexit could have worked, but politicians handled it badly. So it's not necessarily the idea that they don't like, it's the way it's been done.
Yeah, and I suppose logically, those, and most people, 52%, voted to leave the European Union. You don't suppose they're going to change their judgment necessarily on that. They would more likely say, look, it didn't work out the way I hoped.
Yeah, exactly. You know, the big shift, if you look at these numbers, is actually amongst new people entering the electorate. People who were too young to vote at the time. 58% say Brexit was the wrong decision for Britain, and they're driving that shift. It isn't so much that many Remainers or Leavers have changed their minds.
All right, Luke Trill, more in common. That's always a pleasure. Let's talk again, same time next week. Pienaar and Friends is coming up on Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. This is Times Radio, the voice of the times.
It's 6 o'clock. I'm John Pienaar. Welcome to Pienaar and Friends. Tonight, that is Times Radio's Adam Bolton and the former Conservative number 10 advisor, Kirsty Buchanan. And we want to hear from you too. Of course we do. So send us a text, send us a tweet, join in the conversation, and we can chat after the news with Tom Noonan.
This is Times Radio.
Good evening.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, on the free Times Radio app, online and on your smart speaker. Quality journalism, analysis and opinion that speaks for itself. John Pienaar at Drive on Times Radio.
It is good to have you with us on Pienaar and Friends, an hour of good conversation in very good company. Tonight, that is Adam Bolton, my Times Radio colleague, the host and star of our Sunday morning politics programme. Hi to you, Adam.
Hello.
Hi, and also Kirsty Buchanan, former number 10 advisor to the Tory government in number 10. Good to see you, Kirsty.
Good evening.
I want to ask you first, Kirsty, for your thought for the day.
My thought for the day is about the difference between the indefinite and the definite article. Bear with me on this. It just seems to me, certainly the start of this week, we are going to move rapidly from the hokey-cokey that we saw over the budget to the hokey-cokey that we're likely to see over Brexit. Now, obviously, the government's manifesto has this clear red line that we won't be rejoining the customs union, single market, freedom of movement. But we've had these two rather conflicting tonal messages from Keir Starmer this week. On the one hand, he went to the Lady Mayor's banquet and was much more effusive about a stronger working relationship with Europe. And then when this was raised at PMQs, he repeated these red lines. Now, obviously what we've learnt from this budget is this government, like all governments to be fair, is prepared to dance on the head of a pin when it talks about words. Words matter in politics sometimes, and nowhere more than Brexit. So I think the next time anybody gets a chance to talk to Keir Starmer, I think the question I would like posed to him is, OK, you've ruled out as a red line joining the customs union. Will you rule out as a red line joining a customs union? It is the difference between the indefinite and the definite article. There is every world where it seems to me that what this government wants to do is step by step by step move us towards what looks and smells and sounds like a customs union. Now, the politics of that will be very difficult to handle, and there are quite a lot of trade-offs for that. But if you want to sort of have a look at how it potentially works, you can look at EU and Turkey. They are in a customs union, but not in the customs union. And there are some drawbacks to that and some benefits to it. But the thing that some people never really understood about Brexit is it's not a kind of one thing or another. It's a sliding scale. And on one level of it, which is the kind of hard Brexit we ended up with, because nobody would compromise. We had, you've got quite a lot of frictions in your trade caused by a hard Brexit. On the other hand, if you want to improve trading relations, you remove some of those frictions. And it seems to me, dare I say it, that Keir Starmer, who's one of the people that was a principal architect in stopping the Theresa May deal from getting through, might very well be walking us into something that looks and smells and has the contours of Theresa May's deal.
What are you thinking on that, Adam?
Well, I think that's a supreme analysis of the situation, but I would just say it in one context, which is that we tend to, in this country, see this argument as ultimately, are we going to go back on Brexit or not? I think that is a total delusion. The reality is we took that fateful decision to leave the European Union, and we never, I don't think in my lifetime, we're never going to go back on the same basis as we were in before.
No.
Because it's not just our decision. Even if we had another referendum, we voted for it, I don't think the European Union in its right mind would allow us back in, because our relationship is always going to be provisional. There'll always be another political party saying, well, if we win the election, we'll have another election, we'll withdraw or that was... And so I think that relationship of trust is over forever. And therefore, I agree with Kirsty in the sense that I think if we do feel it's in the national interests, which it very often might be, to rebuild relationships with Europe, we have to see it in that context, not in the context of whether it's reconstructing parts of Brexit or not.
There's a powerful argument, isn't there, that in political logic for Labour wanting to move in that direction. I mean, at the moment, their position, and this was argued very, very well by Danny Finkelstein in an article a couple of days ago. I mean, how do you keep on arguing that Brexit was economic self-harm? How can you keep arguing that all that goes with it, there's nothing to be said for it, that it's taken anything, depending on what numbers you pick, between 4, 6, 8% of British GDP, and keep on saying that, and then finish the sentence by saying, well, we're going to get closer by maybe the customs union at least, or the single market. So maybe that's the case for moving that way, maybe even moving that way to promising such a thing in a manifesto at another election, and also an argument for not trying to do it before another election, because for some of the reasons that Adam points out. Imagine Macron, if this thing was seriously proposed now, he would want to do what he's always done, which is to define his success against Britain's lack of it, and there will be others there too.
Well, you're right, there is a powerful argument for it. We're unlikely to hear it any time soon from Keir Starmer. We're almost in this weird position where he's saying, look, Brexit has caused catastrophic harm to our economy, but I'm not going to do really very much about it, which comes back to my point about lots of kind of hokey-cokey language around Britain's relationship with Brexit going forward. I was always struck, a couple of years ago, I listened to Tom Baldwin, the biographer of Keir Starmer, and he said in some event I was at, said if you want to understand where the end direction of Keir Starmer is, look at the steps of the direction of travel he takes. So I think you're probably right. We're looking at something that might build up to the next manifesto and the next election. And between then and now, I think what we're going to get is a lot of this kind of hokey-cokey mixed messages about our relationship and the direction of travel, again from a government that simply just won't set out because it has no defining political, economic message, the sort of relationship it wants with Britain or the sort of Britain it wants to build.
And look, the stack of numbers that Luke Trill from More in Common brought in our brief conversation a moment ago about the latest polls, there was some stuff in there which I'm looking at now about the EU. 56% of people telling the pollsters they want a closer relationship with Europe. Only 14% are more distant one. 30% want to keep the same distance. Even among Reform voters, apparently, 23% want a closer relationship. But you look at some more numbers, and 45% of people say providing EU countries with permanent fishing quotas would be a betrayal of Brexit, and 40% say the same about providing ECHR jurisdiction over EU-UK relations. And that's before any negotiation even begins, assuming it, of course...
I'm slightly reminded of the polls around digital IDs, which were there was a majority of people in this country who were quite fond of the idea of digital IDs until the government proposed it, and then it almost went completely 180, and 66% of people said, no, don't want them now, because Starmer has this reverse Midas touch.
Right. Let me ask Adam for your thought for the day.
Well, my thought for the day may not make me very popular, but it's that I think collectively we lay too much emphasis on so-called victims when something terrible happens and there's a public inquiry. My view is that bad things happen. They may be natural disasters, or there may be bad people doing bad things. But the purpose of an inquiry is A, to establish the facts about what happened, and B, to see if there are any reasonable measures which can be taken to avoid there being a repeat. I do not feel that it's helpful to look at these things as, quotes, justice for victims or the family or the survivors, because I do think bad things happen, and I think people have to face up to the consequences that, not everything's uphill, or not everything can be solved either by, compensation or the creation of a law named after the person who's died or whatever. And I have to say, I am not accusing the Times or Times Radio of this, but I think it's easy journalism always to just go to the victims and have them complain that not enough has been done to compensate them. And I think we do all need to man up a bit about all this.
Okay, Adam, thanks for that. Your thought for the day for today. In a moment, we're going to be looking at a story which is developing pretty much as I speak. It is an enormous, popular culture story across Europe, and I guess for that reason also the rest of the world. It's also a really big political story, a small p political story. Of course, I'm talking about Eurovision, which decided this evening that Israel will be allowed to participate, despite the objections of Israel's critics. Now, since that decision, we have been hearing a lot as the story begins to play out. The Netherlands, they have pulled out. Spain very quickly afterwards. Ireland, a long-time critic of Israel's participation, they are out of Eurovision too. And now Slovenia has confirmed that they're out of Eurovision too. And apparently Iceland and Belgium are going to be deciding on their position in these coming days. I wonder what you think about this. Where are you on the position, the argument behind it on Eurovision, and what this means, if it means much to you? Share your thoughts. Send me a text, 87222, start with the word Times, or a tweet to @Times Radio. And we've been joined in the studio here on Pienaar and Friends by Fraser Nelson, the columnist at The Times, who some of you may well know, some of you may be surprised to hear, is an absolutely passionate supporter and watcher of Eurovision, aren't you, Fraser?
Well, I'm interested in European culture as well as its politics, and the Eurovision is the world's most watched cultural event. It's actually quite hard to understand European politics if you don't follow Eurovision.
Right, we can talk more about that and get Fraser's take as well, as Kirsty, who I gather is a viewer and a lover of Eurovision.
Quite the fan.
I don't know where Adam stands, but we will all find out together here on Pienaar and Friends on Times Radio.
John Pienaar on Times Radio.
And here on Pienaar and Friends, Adam Bolton, of course, we've got Kirsty Buchanan here, too is Fraser Nelson, Times columnist. And we're going to talk now about Eurovision, which is, in some ways, unravelling. Israel will, after all, be allowed to participate, which was more than enough to cause a bit of an exodus. Netherlands will not now take part as a result, nor will Spain, Ireland, Slovenia is out too. Iceland and Belgium deciding whether they're going to follow suit. And Fraser Nelson, before that break, you were saying this is not only a story that's going to capture the attention of an awful lot of people. I was just looking at the audience for Eurovision last time round. It was 166 million people across Europe, and in this country, well, getting on for 7 million people. And so, look, it's not only a story that's going to grab a huge amount of attention. It matters on different levels. Just tell me what you're thinking.
Well, this is the world's most watched non-sporting event. I mean, save for some coronation or something, nothing gets more people from more countries around the television. And in Europe, this is an annual celebration of our culture. I mean, us as in Europeans, this isn't an American thing, kind of goes over American heads, but we celebrate difference. We celebrate the way that you might say that low culture represents countries a bit better than high culture. All the opera and what have you is exactly the same no matter where you go. If you want to see how different countries are, you look at the face they want to present to the world through music, through Schlager, through entertainment, and it's a collision of politics, culture and music. And it is fascinating for that. Now, for Israel, when it was included in 1973, it was a bit funny. Look, is it really a European country? But this is about values, not about geography. Israel is the only country in the Middle East where you can have basically pretty much most acts in Eurovision would be hanging from a lamppost in Eurovision. But, you know, in the Middle East, had they not, well, not from Israel. I mean, to have a trans singer, as they did, Dana International, who won in 2001, that was a great statement why Israel is different. What other country in the Middle East would a trans singer be able to have a real proper career? Israel's defending these European values of diversity, polarity, tolerance, letting people live and let live in a very difficult part of the world, having to constantly fight wars for this. So you would think that its inclusion in Eurovision would be cherished by those who value these values, but it seems not. Yeah, of course, Ireland will and have and will again say that Israel today does not represent those values. They say that a regime, the Netanyahu regime, is a regime of persecution and of mass killing, and the reverse of all of the values you stated to the power. Yeah, well, that's first of all confusing people with this government. Eurovision's about people, it's not about the governments. And then if you're going to get upset about wars, what about Britain that invaded Iraq in 2003, for example? If you're going to go down that road, where do you really stop? Israel as a culture is the most tolerant culture in the Middle East. Only recently they had a trans referee at a football match. Can you imagine that happening anywhere else in the Middle East? When I think about Israel, that is what I think about. This very avant-garde side of Tel Aviv, the way that it allows so many people from so many backgrounds to flourish in a way that simply wouldn't be possible were it not for the values of the Israeli state.
Right, I want to get Adam's view and Kirsty's view. Really keen to hear both of you on this, but just to put a point on that for the moment, Fraser, before we come back to you, are you therefore concluding that this boycott by these countries are wrong-headed, that they are, well, you're nodding your head?
Absolutely. This is a fundamental misunderstanding of what Eurovision is about. This is fundamentally conflating a people with the actions of a government, and it is turning a blind eye to the real struggle that minorities have in the Middle East. Minorities are only safe in Israel. All
right. Adam, tell me, where are you on this?
As a general rule, I don't like boycotts because I think that everyone has faults in their closet, and I think to cooperate with each other constructively is, generally speaking, a good idea. That said, I also think that these countries that are withdrawing are just displaying massive bad manners. I mean, I think if you participate for years in a major event, a major sporting event, a major cultural event, the decision on who participates lies with the organisers and the collective of the organisation. And I think if the organisation decides that they're going to let Israel or anyone else participate, then everyone else should respect that. Otherwise, they are disrespecting the event. Now, people will say, well, what about Russia? Russia's been excluded. Well, that was a collective decision to exclude Russia, which I think is fair enough. But I think if there is not a collective view taken by the organisers and all the participants for individual countries to boycott another country is very dangerous. And you know, Fraser says, and I think he's probably quite right, that not that I am a viewer of Eurovision, I stress that it does display a lot about the cultures of the various countries involved. I just think this kind of behaviour, sadly, does betray a lot about the cultures which we've got at the moment. And I do think there are concerns about, in Ireland being one country in particular, I don't know less well about Spain, but I mean, that clearly Ireland, its attitude towards Israel is bordering into anti-Semitism. You know, we've had the proposals to rename Herzog Park in Dublin. We've had the Israeli embassy being made not welcome in Dublin. I mean, you know, there are strains in European culture relating to Jews and to Israel, which, you know, I think are resurfacing uncomfortably, frankly.
Okay. That's interesting. I'm sort of following your reasoning with interest. And I note your point that in the case of the Olympics, it was the International Olympic Committee that took the decision that they took. I'm just casting back in distant memory for other examples that sort of fit your narrative.
Well, the Eurovision itself, I mean, that excludes Russia.
Well, you'll recall the South Africa cricket boycott, but that of course had a lot to do with South Africa, the team itself, and South African cricket having an apartheid policy in the sport, and so that sort of matches your reasoning too. You're saying a blow against the people of a country should be distinct from a blow against the country, the regime in power.
Yeah.
Kirsty, tell us, you're a fan.
Yeah, I'm a huge fan. It's absolute must-view TV in my house. Look, Eurovision was created to do two things. One, in the kind of birth and explosion of live broadcast, it wanted to test the technological boundaries of broadcast. But mainly, it was created and set up to celebrate what unites communities in the wake of World War II. The first Eurovision was in 1956, I think, from memory. Not that I was around. And so, I completely agree with everything that both Adam and Fraser have said. You know, this is about the power of music and the power of sport. Sometimes we talk about boycotts in sports too, to unite people as politics divides people sometimes, and I think you're in danger of conflating one with the other if you go for a kind of cheap shot like this. And I think that there is a danger between the sort of domestic politics of various different governments playing to a very vocal minority, a substantial minority, but a minority view, I suspect, within this country. It is a huge political headache. I will guarantee that one of the first questions the Prime Minister's official spokesman will get tomorrow in the lobby briefing that they have every morning with the journalists is, what is the Prime Minister's view on whether they should be boycotted or not? And it's also yet another headache, massive cultural headache for our public service broadcaster, the BBC. Yeah. RTE, which is the Irish public service broadcaster, has come out. The BBC, from within its own staff and externally, will face huge pressures around this too. And it's just another kind of BBC getting caught in a huge culture war.
Yeah. I wonder how much this will hurt the regime in Israel. I mean, boycotts, and there aren't too many of this level of profile. They do hurt the countries being targeted. I mean, how much would it hurt in Israel?
I'm not sure this will hurt Israel very much. I mean, I suspect there's all these countries that have boycotted Eurovision, and I think the contest will be watched just as avidly in those countries as it was before. Remember, this is something which is taken by the elites, by the government, not by the people. So I think we should... I'd be very surprised if the viewing figures in Ireland dip very much below where they were before. As far as Israel's concerned, it's had to fight battles every day of its life just to be as it is, to be the kind of country where it is right now, where you can love who you want, you can be who you want. That is fighting battles in so many ways that I think was actually puts it into sharp relief. Now, the strange thing is that in this instance, in my view, it is Israel that is conforming to European values of tolerance, diversity and respect, and it's the other countries protesting against it. They're the ones who are opting out, as it were, of the European values of tolerance, diversity and respect for the people rather than the government. Yes. And also recognition that Israel is holding a light in that region that no other country has come close to being able to hold.
Yeah, I just wonder how many more countries will go down this path. And as we're speaking, Portugal has joined the list of countries saying they're going to be taking a decision on this in coming hours.
That's the first serious blow, because they were getting quite good recently. The one recently with the Portuguese language one. The countries that have dropped out so far have not been very good. Spain hasn't had a good entry since 1968. I mean, Ireland, ever since Johnny Logan, they've been going downhill. The other countries saw it as a bit of a cost. They just got humiliated. I think Ireland's been, most of the years, Ireland doesn't even get to the top 20. So for most of them, spend a lot of money not even making it through to the final because they get voted out in the semis. So they'll be looking for an excuse in a lot of cases.
Apparently, it says here there are 37 countries that compete in Eurovision, and that was the number the last time. I mean, is it possible to have a guess at how many may go down this route and how many will choose not to?
I suspect not very many who had a habit of finishing in the top 10 will go down this route. This is
Ireland's won quite a lot, hasn't it?
Oh no, you're thinking of the Johnny Logan Hold Me Now period, which almost bankrupted Ireland
Dana
because they were
and all that. They kept winning.
Dana was British, by the way. She fielded by Ireland, but that was but that goes to how political Eurovision is. I mean, Ireland fielded as its candidate this girl from the Bogside, who was standing up and talking at the time when the Troubles were at their most high. She was sitting there singing about raindrops and roses and whiskers on kittens or whatever all kinds of everything song was. And yet, so when she won, it was a vote for those forces of peace and tolerance at the time versus a backdrop of war. Politics is always part of Eurovision, but the idea is to have it within the comity of the Eurovision family. Yeah. Now, right now, it is very difficult to pull off a Eurovision winner. The Russians were actually doing it quite well before they were expelled, wrongly in my view. But the countries who are not able to match the high standards that Eurovision now attests will see in this an excuse to slink away from the stage and let the A-team really carry it on.
What about this insinuation that, John, you read out that Israelis were somehow using their digital expertise to fiddle the vote? I mean, that was the I mean, is there any truth in that?
Can you cast any light on that? Because it is pretty clearly suggested. It's not a subject I made a great deep study of. I absolutely admit, but the idea there was organisation from within Israel. It's not clear whether the state or
look, it is
state inspired, but there was some organised.
Well, there was organised.
Of the
there
vote.
was organised advertising calling on people to phone in on the public vote and support for that.
Yeah.
But ultimately, people have still got to pick up the phone and vote with their feet.
I mean,
right?
there was a public backlash. People who wanted to support Israel would vote for its entry sometimes, regardless of the quality of the entry. But let's face it, in 2003, Turkey's entry didn't deserve to win. They only got that because they denied access to the Americans to invade Iraq. At the time, they picked up a big anti-war vote at the time. So you were always going to get these politicised votings. It isn't organised by the Israelis. I mean, the Russians would look into this.
We got null point, didn't we, last time?
Well,
we frequently do.
That's because we always send out an act so bad as to be a passive-aggressive insult to the whole country.
And bear in mind, actually, the contestant last year who won the public vote, the Israeli contestant, was actually a singer who was at the Nova Festival. I'm right, Arnie Fraser, in that. And I think that was one of the reasons she got such a huge public vote.
Yes.
Because the Nova Festival, again, is an example of people coming together from many nations to celebrate culture, and something horrific and traumatic happened to them. And I think there was a lot of sympathy vote for her too, and solidarity for what she had gone through.
Yeah, is it sort of uniquely or particularly British that we seem to have taken, or take year after year, this perverse delight in doing dreadfully in the voting?
It is. No, I'll tell you why. Because we pay almost no effort into choosing our entry. I mean, in Sweden they do it for several weeks. More people vote for that than vote in the general election in Sweden to choose their entry. Ours gets chosen by BBC Politburo, who put minimal entry, who by and large to stay in the contest.
And we almost won a couple of years ago. Had it not been for Ukraine,
because we had a freak. We had a sort of social media sensation. But we have got enough. If you look at all the Eurovision entries this year, so many of the producers I've noticed are actually based in London. So we've got the talent in this country to do it, but we choose not to. I wish that would go back to having the good old sort of Song for Europe proper contests. I think Europe needs Britain very well, very much this year.
Well, in my household, my family love Eurovision. I mean, they watch it passionately. I'm usually in another room. Not because I'm against it, I just don't get
It's
it.
so much fun.
Oh, you don't know what you're missing out on.
This time I'm probably going to tune in just to sort of
It is the world's most inebriated electorate, and it's just a chance. It's the things with Europe. It's the one night that the European people right around the world, all of these languages and cultures, will get together and have the same sort of fun in the same sort of way. And that is, I love to think that it was happening in Reykjavik and in Tel Aviv at the same time. But it's certainly going to be happening in Tel Aviv this year.
No, it's great to get your input on this developing story. We've got some of your thoughts coming in. Kyle says Eurovision withdrawals are misguided and contradictory. They're performative, mistaken and racist. Ellen does not agree with that. We cannot endorse, she says, the nominalisation of a genocidal state more than a matter of manners. It's a matter of human rights and justice. And this in on WhatsApp. Considering Eurovision is about people and not governments, these boycotts display naked anti-Semitism more than anything else. I wonder what you're thinking about this. We'll see how this moves before the end of Pienaar and Friends. Send me a text, 87222, start with the word Times, or a tweet to @Times Radio. And Kate Borsay, who takes over at 7 o'clock now here. Kate, by the way, are you a big Eurovision?
No, I used to watch it when I was younger, and now it's just too long for me and my short attention span. I just wish it would be a bit quicker. I mean.
Well, it's going to be. They're going to be fewer contestants.
Well, yes, exactly.
Israel's chances of winning are getting better by the day.
Absolute bonus. It just goes on a bit long. Really, I just want the really good acts and the really bad acts. I don't want any of the in between. So if we can have a judging panel that just takes out the chaff in the middle, that would completely satisfy me.
Maybe it's just when I walked into the room and looked, all the acts I've ever seen were bad acts. But then again, maybe it's not really for me.
Maybe
but
that's to do with your taste levels, John.
Well, no, precisely, absolutely. Which may or may not be a good thing. Okay, tell me about your show.
Another thing that may or may not be a good thing is Nigel Farage's defence against those racism claims made of him at Dulwich College. He called a press conference at 3 o'clock today to complain about those mayoral elections being delayed till 2028. Many of them in areas that lean into reform, and instead he was asked by more than one reporter about those accusations, and his defence to the BBC reporter was, well, used to use minstrels and broadcast off-colour jokes from the likes of Alf Garnett. So you can talk. Said he wouldn't answer any more questions from the BBC until you apologise for all of your output. I'm not speaking to you, he said. He also, the ITV reporter Harry Horton asked him a question and he just sort of spoke over him and then laid into ITV for broadcasting Bernard Manning. I don't know whether it's the best form of attack, I have to say. And the thing is, these accusations are going to follow Nigel Farage around as long as people keep popping up and making them. He'd argued that he'd actually received a letter from a Jewish person at Dulwich, same time as him, who said that his jokes were not racist, sometimes offensive, but never with malice, was what Farage said that letter said in his defence. So we'll talk a little about him, actually, and actually whether he needs to address this a little more thoroughly than that. We'll talk about the fall of the Assad regime in Syria. Richard Spencer for The Times is in Aleppo, and he'll talk about what Syria looks like now. It's a really fascinating story, because actually many families in Syria are now worse off after the fall of Assad. So we'll get some understanding on that. And we'll talk about the World Cup draw tomorrow in Washington, featuring Donald J. Trump. He's got YMCA playing out. It's in Washington rather than in Vegas, where I think it was meant to be held.
Is he drawing the balls from the ball or whatever it is?
I don't think so.
It'd be odd if he didn't, wouldn't it? How can he resist that?
Well, there is the small matter of the FIFA Peace Prize. Guess who's that? Who that's hotly tipped to go to?
Yeah. Guesses on a postcard or on a text. Looking forward to that with the UK. And we are going to cross over stateside right after the news, which is a little bit late. It's 6:34. Let's get the news with Tom Noonan.
Across the UK, on DAB, online and on your smart speaker. John Pienaar at Drive on Times Radio.
And here with me on Pienaar and Friends, we got Adam Bolton and we got Kirsty Buchanan, and we're joined now from across the ocean by Daniel Lippman, the Washington reporter for Politico. Welcome to you, Daniel.
Thanks for having me.
You're very welcome to the show. There's always a few things that I'm keen to catch up on about this point in the programme when we look at what's going on in the USA. Let me just start with the negotiations in Miami. I say negotiations, I've no clue as to how much is actually being negotiated, but the Ukrainian envoy is due there to have another session with Steve Witkoff, Donald Trump's envoy, and they're going to be talking about what might be done as far as a deal on Ukraine. Got to say, you have to start with an expectation very, very, very low. And what is the expectation there?
Yeah, I think it's just to make any bit of progress, especially on the security guarantees, because that had been a holdup where they're in the first iteration of the 20-some-odd point plan that was mostly what Russia wanted. There was a kind of a dictate saying, hey, we'll do the security guarantees after the deal, and that is not acceptable for Ukraine. And so they want to have this on the front end. And so that's going to be one of their top priorities in these meetings in Miami.
Well, and that is, as you say, an important and sensitive point in these talks about Ukraine. Are you able to shed any light on this? Because I think I saw that America was ready to move on the question of joining in, offering some support for a security guarantee for Ukraine when and if there's a ceasefire, to support that ceasefire. And it was suggested that President Trump might be up for some sort of deal akin to the NATO Article 5 promise of you attack one of us, you attack all of us. Can he mean that as it sounds there? Or are we talking about something much more limited? Or do we not know?
We don't really fully know, but I think it would probably be something in the middle. That's what I'm hearing from my sources. And that if you go, the problem is when you go to the one direction, then you can't get Russia on board. If you go to the far direction, then you can't get Ukraine on board. And so that's going to be any type of peace negotiation. And so I don't think it's going to be more involved than Article 5. And this stuff is kind of written on paper. It's only been invoked, I think, once when after 9/11.
Yeah.
And Trump has made a lot of noise where he doesn't really care about binding international agreements. He's pulled us out of the U.S. deal with Iran in the first term. He's pulled us out of a lot of environmental regulations, other world treaties. He doesn't seem that interested in abiding. He even talked yesterday or this week, saying, oh, maybe we'll see if I stay in USMCA, which is the NAFTA 2.0 between Mexico, US, and Canada. And so everything is up for negotiation for him, basically.
Yeah. Adam and Kirsty, I mean, it is, isn't it, absolutely impossible to imagine Donald Trump agreeing to a NATO equivalent, a NATO Article 5 equivalent. The idea that he would commit as part of a deal to American joining in a war against Russia if Russia attacks and breaks a peace deal with Ukraine.
Yes, it is. And of course, the big question is why doesn't the rest of NATO just say, OK, after a peace deal, Ukraine, what remains of Ukraine can become a member? And that is something which we know Putin is shooting for, having ruled out in a peace deal, although quite how Russia's not in NATO could seek to bind NATO is a different matter. But I mean, that's the truth of it. The truth of it is either the Europeans, and this has been said by Katja Kallas, the European spokesman, either Europe is really committed to Ukraine and is prepared to let it join NATO, as it's apparently going to join the European Union, or it's not.
I mean, we're in the same position now we were at the start of the year, which is, the coalition of the willing talking a good game, but actually not really advancing, much in terms of filling in that gap. And I suspect if you sort of press on Trump and what he really means by this, we're talking about probably what he said at the start of the year, which is, if there are American contractors on the ground, Russia wouldn't possibly think of invading, rather than any meaningful security backup. So look, Russian forces now control 85% of the Donbass. All Putin has done this entire year is grind out the conversations, grind out the negotiations, play for time, while Russian troops take more and more and more of the Donbass and people sit back and do it. Europe has always given Ukraine enough weapons and enough support not to lose the war, but never enough to win it. So, ultimately, I think, Ukraine is in this invidious position. At what point do they just accept that the Donbass is, to all intents and purposes, gone and try and freeze the conflict there before they lose the entire region?
Okay. I mean, Daniel Lippman at the Washington Politico in Washington. I'm really keen, while you're with us, and again, thank you for coming along. I really want to get your thoughts on what is an American political story, but still a really remarkable one. The news that a company, a startup, which is backed by Donald Trump Jr. It is a minerals company, a new company, as I say, backed by Donald Trump Jr. Through his investment fund, has been given a $600+ million deal by the Pentagon. Which, you see that and your eyes go a very long way up. I wonder how that's playing in America. Do tell us the answer to that in a second, Daniel. You're listening to Pienaar and Friends on Times Radio.
John Pienaar on Times Radio.
Adam Bolton is here, Kirsty Buchanan is here, and so is Daniel Lippman from Politico. Daniel, let me come to you at this point. I was looking at the story, pretty widely reported now, that a company, a startup, has won support, $620 million worth from the Pentagon, from the military, the United States military. The company happens to be backed by an investment firm managed, controlled by Donald Trump Jr. And apparently 4 previous deals have been won from the Donald Trump presidency's administration this year alone. How big is that playing, and how loud are the comments and the questions about what some would naturally fear could amount to a conflict of interest?
Yeah, this is something that we did not really see as much in the first Trump administration. The closest equivalent would be foreign embassies holding parties at the Trump hotel in D.C. or at various Trump golf courses around the world. But this is they really kind of unchecked corruption, even if it's just the perception just stinks and is not going along well with many Americans. The issue is that a lot of people are numb to this. They have seen this every few weeks. Oh, Trump gets a jet from Qatar. Trump signs, his family signs new deals in, the Balkans or Asia or the Middle East. And so, all the crypto deals. And so it just has not affected many Americans in terms of who they're going to vote for. But it adds to the kind of the culture around Trump, where this is a lame duck president. He used to be a Republican. He used to be a Democrat, so he doesn't care what happens to the Republican Party after he's gone. And so he's just trying to make the most of it and make them. His family's trying to make the most amount of money during these 4 years.
I mean, obviously, anything remotely like this wouldn't fly for a solitary second in this country. But it is all very much out in the open in America. Everything that's going on. Well, we know that this is going on. We don't know what we don't know, as Don Rumsfeld might have said. But this, we're told, confirms to all the safeguards and guardrails of the Pentagon. Is there any way of testing that claim by the Pentagon and by the White House?
Yeah, I think it's something where rare earths have been a huge topic of conversation for America, for European countries, because we have been very reliant on China. And so it's not like they created some new problem that there was no such problem. And so this company may very well be qualified for this type of loan. They have looked at other companies to give Pentagon support to create rare earth minerals in America, to not be held hostage by that from China. but it's also kind of the perception. And so I think Donald Trump Jr. is smart. He knows that rare earths is a huge topic that companies that are investing in it, just like AI, they're going to profit. And so that's why he's putting some of this money in.
Yeah. Kirsty and Adam. I mean, Kirsty, to British eyes, this is gobsmacking stuff.
Yeah, it's absolutely extraordinary. It's a huge amount of money, and whilst the line from the Pentagon is all the normal processes have been followed, and there is no evidence to suggest that Donald Trump Jr. in any way lobbied on that. The counter argument, and that's, well, he doesn't have to. This fund 1789 is well known to be linked to him, and in a lot of ways that we see a lot of companies in America bowing down to and accepting the reality, the political reality in which they operate at the moment. You'd have to think the same thing possibly is happening here. I mean, there is an argument, leading aside the process on it, there is an argument obviously for backing innovation within defence and trying to shore up, not just against China in terms of its dominance in the global market around rare earth materials, not just in terms of its ownership of mining of those, but refineries, which is a real problem, and one where America has quite a lot of access to the rare earth materials. What it really needs is to get better in terms of refining those processes, because almost all of that market at the moment is owned by China because it's so environmentally destructive. So this is where America is looking to make gains. Should it be making like this? Probably not. Does it really fail the smell test to British faces, noses? Yes, of course it does. It just looks corrupt.
Look, I mean, let's be straightforward about this. It's quite clear that the behaviour of the Trump family, the Trump administration, is in violation of American law. It would be impeachable, and it's probably against the Constitution as well. But the point is, persistently, as we just heard, Donald Trump is getting away with this, and there's no one within the system who's in a position to stop him. And there is a general shrugging about it. I mean, I was speaking today to a senior Republican Party spokesman, and he just said, "Oh, well, the Donald Trump way: make money, not war," and that's accepted as his view. And if you look, even in the peace proposal that was put forward by Witkoff, and incidentally, why is a businessman and a son-in-law negotiating world peace on behalf of Trump? And that actually includes money coming back to the United States and to America from Ukraine for brokering or forcing a peace upon them. I mean, it is unconscionable what's going on, and yet it seems that nothing can be done about it, and the net effect of it is that it rots the whole system.
And the Democrats are tearing their hair out. Here is corruption writ large, and it doesn't seem to have a huge impact on the polls. If ever there was a great example of, it's the economy stupid, it's what's going on at the moment. As long as Trump's popularity, we've got the midterms in 2026, that will almost entirely be determined by one factor, which is cost of living. It won't be determined by the behaviour of Trump or those around him or of the wider party. It will be determined by inflation, the impact on people's pockets of having Trump in for 2 years. And if that's working, then they're likely to have a relatively strong base. And their core MAGA vote hasn't really disrupted at all, despite this kind of, the difference that people see, this massive gulf between a man who came in promising to champion, working man and drive down prices for ordinary people, and actually all he's done since he's been in there is feather the nest of himself, his billionaire friends, his tech bros, crypto bros. And actually, inflation remains quite sticky and is slightly creeping up in America. So that ultimately will be what determines the fortunes of the Republican Party in the midterms next year. And if they lose both houses, there might be a little bit more checks and balances on them, which possibly explains why there's such a hurry to feather
if he loses the House,
but the rest
there'll be impeachments.
The rest
if he loses the House,
the rest of the world, foreign governments have just decided that the way to deal with Trump is to flatter him and pay tribute. I mean, that's basically...
And wait him out.
That's the way it's going. And the wait him out is an interesting point as to whether he's done so much damage to America that it won't be possible for someone to go back to be a law-abiding president. But this is where the, things like Don Trump Jr. and the amount of money that they're making from crypto matters, in as much as are they going to end up being so rich and so attached to the tech bros that, even after Trump, they're just going to have the power and the money to carry on and put some other person like Don Jr. or Barron.
Last word with Daniel Lippman. Again, thanks for joining us, Daniel. Where's this going to go? Assuming it goes very far.
Yeah, I think that there's going to be investigations once if Democrats take control in the House or the Senate next year. But I think that you have to wonder what J.D. Vance thinks of this, because he wants to claim the mantle of 2028. And if Republicans get slaughtered next year, then that's going to be very tough. I was talking to senior Republicans close to Trump, and they're just worried about the coalition around Trump splintering in terms of Hispanics, Black Americans, Arab Americans, young people, and so they are not optimistic that Republicans can keep together that coalition that Trump built.
Yeah, and there does seem to be some early signs of that in the recent special elections. The mayoral election, obviously won by a Democrat, but the New Jersey election, the Virginia election, we saw some of that splintering of the coalition which took Trump to power last year. Daniel Lippman, really good to have you on. Thank you so much. Let's talk again before long. So before we close for this evening, just want to pick up on that thought about our politics, about Nigel Farage, who was criticising, as we heard, the BBC and ITV for their questions at a news conference earlier.
Until you apologise for all of your output, your appalling output, at the same time that I'm accused of saying these things which I deny, I'm not speaking to you. All right? Very good. Harry, you are wasting your time. Bernard Manning. Do you want to hear some of the Bernard Manning jokes on ITV?
I don't know if that's what he did. What do you think about the way that he is handling this, and how big a problem is it, Adam?
Well, it's classic whataboutery, and he's a skillful politician, and it's quite a clever thing for him to bring up, so full marks for that. My own feeling about this is that he has yet to say, yes, I did this, and yes, it's wrong, and I'm a different person. And until he does that, that will be a break on his wider appeal. I'd also make one other point, which has not been made, is I'm actually older than Nigel Farage, as I think you are. And when I was at school, it would not be acceptable for someone to behave as he did reportedly. And, this notion that, it was just banter and everyone was like that back then, just not true. And that is what really shocks me, that, this school where he attended, they actually made him a prefect. The schools I went to, someone like that would have been disciplined and probably expelled for that type of behaviour.
Yeah, up to a point, Adam. As you say, I am older than you and Farage, and when I was at school, I was one of two boys in my boys' school who were not white, and racism was common currency. It was just absolutely common currency, and the question of someone being expelled or being called out for it just didn't really arise. Bullying had it got to the point of a boy being really seriously systemically victimised. The teachers at my school would have come down on that had they been made aware of it. But bullying generally and racial abuse, that kind, it was a kind of a normality to it. It was a different time, just as it was at football grounds, where it was ultra normal. Believe me, when I went to football a lot at that time, nothing remotely unusual about it. So different now. But I do take your point and share it. I don't see why Farage doesn't go further and react to the real point here, which is it's not about punishment or being held to account for exactly what he may have said in Dulwich College playground. It's about arguing that he's not the same person as he was then.
Which takes us back to the start and the thought of the day, isn't it? One of the reasons that trust erodes in politics is because politicians aren't honest. They're not honest. They use weasel words. They try and skirt around situations. They say, "Oh, it was a bit of banter," when we all know what it is, which was utterly vile, racist bullying. I don't understand. I agree with you. I think the the press conference this morning was a little bit like Trump playbook. You know, you're this and you're that, and you haven't got a leg to stand on. Look, you know, the person I don't think has got a leg to stand on here is Farage. He should just turn around and say, look, I was a nasty bit of works. If you really want to be a different type of politician, if you really want to be not like the uni party that he's always going on about, then act like it. Come out, be honest, have a conversation with this poor bloke whose life he made an absolute misery when he was at school, and say, I was a nasty bit of works then, I'm not that person now, and I would like to publicly apologise. I also agree with Adam. The fact that he hasn't at some point got in contact with this chap way before all this blew up and apologised for being so vile when he was younger says a lot to me about the man anyway. Because the chap who he bullied has said a lot of other people who bullied him at the time in subsequent years have got in contact with him and said, look, I'm sorry, I was an absolute swine to you.
Okay, I was so interested in your thoughts on that before we close, but we will close after what we do at this point, which is just lastly asking you for a prediction, just to leave out there. I mean, I do like sort of unexpected predictions and counterintuitive ones, but either way, just keen to chuck one out there, and we'll chew on that before the end of the show.
My prediction is that Robert Jenrick will not join Reform UK, and I will even go further and say I don't think any current member of the shadow cabinet will join Reform UK this side of the general election.
Is that informed by the idea that Kemi Badenoch seems to be doing a bit better than before?
And also I think that Reform is not doing quite as well as it was doing before, but I also think what is happening is that on the economy and on this question, dividing lines are beginning to emerge between the current Conservative Party and Reform, whereas I think if you go back a year, they were blurring quite seriously.
Kirsty, your prediction?
Least surprising prediction of all time. Tomorrow is the first YouTube Liz Truss show. I predict this will be the highest rating she will ever get, and I also predict the reviews will be absolutely scathing.
Okay, they both sound like reasonably predictable predictions, but nonetheless valuable and nonetheless welcome for all that. Guys, Kirsty, Adam, thank you so much. Ollie Cole was our producer. Isaac Marley was at the keyboards, and Kate is on her way in. I'm John Pienaar. See you next week on Times Radio.
Across the UK, on DAB digital radio, online and on your smart speaker. This